Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. I work at a small office in the city, tucked away in a building that has stood for decades. It's not a place you'd expect to find anything particularly spooky, just another office building where people shuffle in and out every day, doing their jobs, going home to their families, and then returning to do it all over again the next day. It's one of those buildings that you could easily forget about, even while you're standing inside it. The floors are carpeted with beige tiles that have seen better days, and the fluorescent lights buzz above your head, casting an unflattering, sterile glow over the place. I've been working here for almost 2 years now. The job isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I don't mind it too much. I spend most of my days staring at a computer screen, typing up reports, answering emails, and dealing with clients over the phone. The days tend to blend into one another, each one a slight variation of the last. The same faces pass by me every morning, some with their coffee in hand, some with papers stacked high, all of us simply doing our jobs. There are a few people I've gotten to know over the time I've worked here. Mark, the office manager, is one of them. He's in his mid-40s, a bit of a neat freak, always making sure everything is in order. Then there's Paul, the IT guy, who keeps to himself mostly, but has a dry sense of humor. His desk is always a mess of wires and hard drives, but when something breaks down, he's the one who fixes it. And of course, there's Linda, the receptionist, who greets everyone with a smile, though I sometimes get the sense that there's more to her than meets the eye. She's been working here for years, longer than I've been around, and seems to know everyone's business. It was just an average day at work when I first noticed it, the room at the end of the hallway. I had passed by it 100 times before, always too busy with my own work to pay much attention. But one afternoon, as I was heading to the break room, I glanced down that hallway and saw something different. The door, which had always been locked, was slightly ajar. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make most people stop and stare, but something about it struck me as strange. It wasn't that the door was open after all. Doors do tend to open from time to time, but the fact that it was almost as if someone had forgotten to close it properly. Just a crack, but enough to make you wonder if someone had been in there. I couldn't help but stare at it for a few seconds longer than I should have. The hallway was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning, and for a brief moment it felt as though time had stopped. The rest of the office was as it always was, people typing away, phones ringing, the occasional laugh, but that room at the end of the hallway felt different. It felt off. I should have just ignored it. Maybe it was just another maintenance closet or storage space that nobody used anymore. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I found myself walking over to the door, my footsteps sounding louder than usual in the quiet hallway. When I reached it, I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap between the door and the frame. I couldn't remember ever seeing anyone enter or exit that room, and I wondered if it had always been locked. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the door handle, unsure whether to push it open. A part of me wanted to find out what was inside, but another part of me warned against it. You see, there's something about locked doors, whether they're in old houses, abandoned buildings, or even places like this, that stir up a sense of unease. I pushed the door open just a little more, the old hinges creaking in protest. I peered inside, half expecting to find nothing but a broom and some cleaning supplies. But the room beyond was unlike any of the other rooms in the building. It was small and cramped, with peeling paint on the walls and dusty shelves filled with forgotten office equipment. It looked like a room that hadn't seen much attention in years. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place at that moment. A strange feeling, like a heavy weight pressing against my chest, settled over me as I looked around. There was no obvious reason for it. Nothing in the room looked particularly strange or out of place, but I felt the unmistakable sensation that I was intruding on something I shouldn't have. I quickly shut the door, dismissing the feeling as just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was just an old storage room, probably filled with stuff nobody ever used. I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. But as I walked back down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just uncovered something I wasn't supposed to know about. And that feeling would linger with me, growing stronger in the days to come. Little did I know, the discovery of that locked room would be the beginning of something far more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. In the days following my discovery of the locked room, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked past that hallway, I found my gaze drifting toward the door. It wasn't as if I had any reason to believe something strange was going on there, at least, not at first. But there was an undeniable nagging feeling in the back of my mind, one that I couldn't seem to shake off. The building itself seemed fine, nothing out of the ordinary. The air conditioning hummed at its usual rhythm. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the buzz of keyboards tapping and phones ringing filled the space. Yet, there was an unshakable tension that had crept into the air ever since I had laid eyes on that room. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, it was an old building, and buildings like that often had rooms that weren't used anymore. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about that room felt wrong. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that the first real incident happened. I was sitting at my desk, typing away at another report when I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I had imagined it a soft sound, almost like a scraping or rustling, coming from somewhere down the hall. I glanced around the office, and for a moment, I thought I had just heard something from one of the other rooms. But no one else seemed to react. The usual hum of voices, footsteps, and phones was still in place. I tried to ignore it and went back to my work. But then it happened again. This time, I was certain I had heard it as scraping sound, followed by a muffled thud. It was coming from that room, the locked one. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was a strange sound, almost like something or someone was trying to get out. But no one was supposed to be in there. I hadn't seen anyone near that door since I first noticed it. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly shook off the feeling. It's nothing, I told myself. Just some old pipes or equipment acting up. But that didn't stop me from glancing over at the hallway again. And this time, I saw something that made my heart race. The door, which I had seen shut tight the day before, was slightly ajar. The same crack as before. It wasn't wide open, but just enough to make me uneasy. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. Linda, the receptionist, was the next to pass by my desk. She walked past with her usual calm demeanor, but as she neared the hallway, she paused. I could see her glance down the corridor, her eyes briefly flicking to the door at the end. "Did you hear that?" she asked me, her voice low. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to tell her what I had just heard. I didn't want to sound paranoid or overreacting. "I think it's just the building settling," I said, trying to sound casual. Linda didn't seem convinced. "It sounded like something was moving in there," she said quietly. Like someone was trying to open the door. I couldn't help but shiver at her words. It was exactly what I had thought. And yet, Linda's unease made me question whether I was being irrational. It wasn't like we worked in some ancient, abandoned mansion. This was just a regular office building, nothing out of the ordinary. But then again, why was the door ajar when it was always locked before? And what about that strange sound? Linda shrugged and walked away, but I noticed she shot one last glance down the hallway before disappearing behind her desk. That little glance spoke volumes. It was as if she was also unsure of what was going on, but didn't want to bring it up. That evening, I stayed a little later than usual to finish up a few tasks. The office had mostly emptied out, with only a few stragglers still typing away. As the minutes ticked by, I couldn't focus on my work. My thoughts kept drifting back to that room. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But every time I looked down the hallway, that door seemed to pull me in, like a magnet drawing me closer. At around 7:30 p.m., I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder. The unmistakable scrape of something heavy shifting against the floor. I felt my stomach churn as I slowly looked up from my desk. The hallway was silent, the dim light flickering slightly above me. The door at the end of the hall, once again, was slightly ajar. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy as I made my way toward the door. My mind was a swirl of conflicting thoughts. Should I check it out? Should I call someone? Or was I just being foolish, letting my imagination get the best of me? I approached the door slowly, my breath shallow. I couldn't help but feel like I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. As I got closer, I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I touched the door handle. It was cold to the touch, much colder than I would have expected. Before I could open the door, I heard a noise from inside, something I couldn't explain. A soft whispering, almost like the faintest breath of wind, but with an eerie quality to it. It wasn't clear words, just an indistinct murmur. I yanked my hand away from the handle, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no mistaking it. That was not the sound of a draft or an air vent. Someone or something was in there. I quickly backed away, my mind racing. My first instinct was to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But as I turned to leave, I froze. In the dim light, I saw something move. A shadow. It flickered across the floor near the door, too fast for me to fully register what it was. I didn't wait another second. I bolted back to my desk, heart pounding in my chest. I quickly gathered my things and left the office, my thoughts a blur as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something truly strange going on in that room? The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I knew I had to tell someone, but I wasn't sure who. Mark was always the logical one, but I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. Linda had noticed it too, but she hadn't said much more. For now, all I could do was wait and wonder, what was really in that room? And why did it feel like something was watching me every time I walked past? As the days passed, the strange occurrences grew more frequent, and with each passing moment, I found myself becoming more and more unsettled. The building was still the same on the surface, quiet, calm, and filled with the usual hustle of office life. But beneath that facade, something was undeniably off. It wasn't just the sound anymore. No, the noises had evolved. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the building itself was shifting, groaning under some hidden weight. But then it grew louder. The scraping sound I'd heard in the hallway, it became almost rhythmic, like someone or something was dragging a heavy object back and forth, over and over again. I'd be sitting at my desk, trying to concentrate on my work, and out of nowhere, that low, deliberate noise would seep through the walls, sending a chill down my spine. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the building settling, or maybe some old machinery coming to life. But when the sound started happening at regular intervals, I began to realize that there was no way this was just a coincidence. It was happening when no one was around, and sometimes, even in the dead of night when the office was empty. Linda, too, seemed to have picked up on it. I saw her glancing nervously down the hallway whenever she passed by my desk. It was clear that she wasn't sure what was going on, but she could feel the change, the tension in the air. And Mark, well, he was the first person I decided to talk to about it. He wasn't one for superstition, but I figured that if anyone could look at the situation logically, it would be him. One afternoon, about a week after my first encounter with the door, I found myself walking toward Mark's office. I needed answers, or at the very least, I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. As I approached his door, I could hear him on the phone, his voice low and steady. He looked up when I knocked, a slight furrow in his brow as he motioned for me to come in. "Hey, what's up?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit down. I hesitated for a moment before I spoke, my voice lower than usual. "Mark, there's something strange going on here. I don't know what it is, but I can't ignore it anymore." His expression softened, and he put the phone down, giving me his full attention. "What's going on? You've been acting a little off lately." I took a deep breath. There's this room down the hall. It's been locked up for as long as I've worked here. But lately, there's been noise. It sounds like something is in there, moving around. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but didn't interrupt. I continued, telling him about the scraping sound, the strange murmuring I had heard one night, the feeling that something was just wrong. When I finished, Mark leaned back in his chair, clearly processing what I had said. Okay, I get it. But have you actually seen anything? Have you checked out the room yourself? I hesitated. I've been too scared to go in, but I've seen the door open on its own. And I swear I saw something move inside once. Mark rubbed his chin thoughtfully. All right, here's what we'll do. We'll go check it out together. If nothing's going on, we'll both laugh it off and move on with our lives. I wasn't sure what to think of his suggestion. Part of me was relieved to have him by my side, but another part of me was deeply uneasy. Still, I agreed. That evening, after most of the office had cleared out for the day, we made our way down the hallway. The building was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. As we approached the door, my heart began to race again, just like it had the first time I had stood in front of it. The door was slightly ajar again, just like before, but this time I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a faint stain on the floor, just inside the threshold. It looked dark, almost black, and my mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Mark must have noticed it too, because he stopped in his tracks. Is that blood? He asked, his voice tight. I swallowed hard, not wanting to look too closely. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. I don't know. I can't explain it. Mark took a cautious step forward, his hand resting on the doorknob. All right, I'm opening it. Stay close. I felt my breath catch in my throat as he slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. It was so still in there that I almost wondered if the building had swallowed all sound. We both stood frozen in place for a long moment. There was nothing out of the ordinary in the room, no signs of movement, no strange shadows. But that was the problem. It was too still. Okay, Mark said after what felt like an eternity. Let's go in. We'll check it out together. I hesitated. What if we shouldn't? Mark gave me a reassuring look. Look, it's probably just some old maintenance stuff. We'll go in, take a quick look, and leave. No big deal. But as we stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The room was cold, unreasonably cold, considering how warm it had been outside. My breath fogged in the air, and I shivered involuntarily. The walls were bare, save for a few old, rusted filing cabinets that lined the walls. The faint smell of mildew filled the air, and I couldn't help but feel the heavy weight of the silence pressing down on me. We moved deeper into the room, scanning the area. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. Then, just as we were about to leave, something caught my eye, a small object on the ground, just beneath one of the filing cabinets. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it appeared to be a piece of cloth, dark and tattered. My curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to pick it up. As soon as my fingers brushed the fabric, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, so intense that it took my breath away. I stood up, eyes wide, looking around the room. That's when I saw it. At the far corner of the room, behind an old filing cabinet, there was a door. I was sure it hadn't been there before. It wasn't visible when we entered the room. I didn't know where it came from, but it was there now, and I could feel its presence. It stood slightly ajar, as though inviting us in. I turned to Mark, but when I looked back, he was already walking toward it. Without saying a word, I followed him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop. But my legs wouldn't obey. I glanced at the door as we approached. The dark space beyond seemed to shift and pulse, as though something was waiting for us. We were about to find out just how far this strange series of events would go, but none of us could have prepared for what happened next. As Mark and I stood at the threshold of the newly revealed door, the air around us seemed to thicken, pressing in on us with a heaviness that made every breath feel labored. The door stood before us, slightly ajar, the faintest light emanating from within. At first, it seemed almost innocuous, a simple wooden door, worn with age, like every other door in the building. But there was something about it, something wrong. For a moment, neither of us moved. The chill in the air had deepened since we stepped into the room, and the silence was almost unbearable. The faint creak of the building settling was the only sound, and it only seemed to add to the growing tension. Mark took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't respond immediately. My mind was racing. Should we open the door? Should we turn back? But something compelled me to take that final step forward. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps fear, or maybe I was just too far gone to stop. Whatever it was, it drove me to nod, a silent agreement to whatever fate awaited us behind that door. Mark didn't hesitate any longer. He pushed the door open. The moment the door swung inward, we were hit with an overpowering stench, something foul, something decayed. It was a smell I couldn't even begin to place, but it made my stomach churn. I had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. I squinted into the room, but the light was dim, almost non-existent. It was as if the darkness within refused to let anything else in. I stepped forward, my footfalls echoing loudly against the concrete floor. Mark, however, hesitated. He had already started to look visibly unnerved. The space was much larger than I expected. A small room like this shouldn't have felt as expansive as it did. The walls were covered in grime, old peeling paint, and strange markings I couldn't quite make out. The room was filled with bookshelves, tables piled high with paperwork, and scattered objects that seemed to have been untouched for years. Yet, in the middle of the room, there was something that didn't belong. A single, large, dark wooden box. It was positioned in the center, and though I couldn't see it clearly, I felt its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to draw the very air around it into a tight, painful knot. I stepped closer, my feet dragging over the worn floorboards, every step louder than the last. The box stood before us like a grave, ancient and ominous, its surface smooth and dark. No labels, no indication of what it might contain. Then, out of nowhere, Mark spoke. "I don't like this, man. Something's wrong. This room, it doesn't feel right." I wanted to agree with him, wanted to say something to reassure him, but my voice was lost somewhere deep in my throat. Something was coming. I could feel it, the air around us growing colder by the second. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, there was a sound, a loud bang, followed by a faint scraping noise. It came from behind the box. Mark and I both turned sharply, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. A low moan echoed from the shadows behind the box, a sound that seemed too unnatural to be human. It wasn't a cry, nor a groan, but something deeper, something primal, as if the very walls of the building were groaning in pain. My heart raced in my chest, my hands clammy with sweat, as I strained to see anything that might explain the sound. "Mark?" I whispered, barely able to force the words out. "What the hell is that?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, his eyes widened with terror, his breath shallow as he slowly took a step back. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Now." But it was already too late. The moment Mark turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a near-splitting crash, trapping us inside. The room, once eerily quiet, was now alive with an overwhelming presence. Something was in here with us. The shadows around the room seemed to deepen, twisting unnaturally, forming shapes that shouldn't have been possible. The walls were no longer just walls, they seemed to pulse, like the very building was breathing. I spun around, my pulse racing. "What the hell? What's happening?" I shouted, my voice cracking. That's when I saw a figure, standing by the box, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long twisted limbs that stretched out toward us like gnarled branches. Its face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel its eyes, cold and unblinking, staring right into me. A cold, bitter laugh echoed through the room, and I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't make any sound beyond that haunting, low chuckle. But somehow, I knew it was looking at me, waiting for something. Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "We have to get out. We have to leave. It's not real. It can't be real." But I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The figure's eyes seemed to bore into my very soul, and I felt the floor beneath me shift, the room closing in. The temperature had dropped to an unbearable chill, and every breath I took felt like I was breathing in ice. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as the silence between us stretched longer and longer. The figure took a step forward, its movement smooth and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Mark's hand shot out, his fingers brushing mine as if trying to pull me away, but it was no use. The figure was getting closer, its form warping, shifting in and out of the shadows, never quite fully solid. That's when I heard a voice, not from the figure, but from somewhere else in the room behind us, within the walls, from every direction. It was a low, guttural whisper, its words barely discernible. "You should not have come." The air grew heavy, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. The figure was right in front of us now, towering over us with a malevolent presence. It raised a hand, long fingers curled into a twisted claw, reaching for us. I don't remember what happened next. All I remember is the surge of panic, the overwhelming need to escape. I turned, pulling Mark with me as I lunged for the door. But the moment we touched the handle, the world seemed to spin, and I was thrown back across the room. The last thing I remember before everything went black was that horrible laugh, that bone-chilling sound that echoed through the room, followed by the feeling of someone grabbing me from behind. I woke up to a sharp pain in my head, the taste of metal and something sour lingering in my mouth. My body ached all over as if I had been thrown from a great height, my muscles sore from a struggle I couldn't fully remember. It was disorienting, the way the world felt slightly off kilter, like my mind couldn't quite catch up with what had happened. My eyes fluttered open, but the light was dim, soft, as though I were still trapped in the suffocating darkness of that room. The first thing I noticed was that I wasn't alone. Mark was sitting beside me, his back against the cold concrete wall, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked pale, exhausted, his eyes wide with disbelief. When he saw that I was awake, he gave a shaky exhale of relief. "You're okay," he muttered, though his voice was tight, strained. "You're okay." I tried to sit up, but my head swam, and I had to brace myself against the wall. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice hoarse. I had no idea how much time had passed. The memories of that night of the door, the figure, the laugh seemed distant, like a nightmare I couldn't quite shake off. "We're outside," Mark said, his eyes flickering to the door at the far end of the room we were in. The same door, the one that had locked us in, trapping us with whatever was in there. We got out. I don't know how, but we did. I looked around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was small, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. It looked like some kind of storage space, empty crates, shelves lined with old equipment, dust motes floating in the air. But there was something eerily quiet about it, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I closed my eyes and tried to steady myself, my mind still racing. What had happened? What had that thing been? The figure, the voice, none of it made sense. And why had it let us go? Why hadn't it taken us? I didn't have any answers. None of us did. The door slammed behind us in that room. We had to have escaped somehow, but how? The moments before everything went black were a blur. Mark and I scrambling to the door, the figure right behind us, reaching for us, and then darkness. I couldn't make sense of it. Was it all just a hallucination? A shared nightmare? But that didn't feel right either. It had been too real. "Do you remember how we got out?" I asked Mark, my voice still shaky. He looked down at his hands, his fingers rubbing together in nervous agitation. I don't know, he admitted, his voice distant. I don't remember. It's like, one minute we were standing there, and the next we were outside. He stopped, swallowing hard. I don't know what happened, but I don't want to go back in there. Ever. I nodded, feeling the same way. The thought of returning to that room, to that presence, was enough to make my skin crawl. Whatever had been in there, whatever had been watching us, I didn't want to face it again. I wasn't sure if I could. We sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the occasional creak of the building settling around us. It was as if the place had become a tomb, quiet and still, waiting. But in that silence, something began to stir inside me, a gnawing sense of unease. Mark, I said suddenly, my voice urgent. What about the box? The one in the middle of the room? Mark's face paled even further. The box? He repeated, his voice trembling. You're sure you saw a box? I frowned, my mind racing. Of course, I saw it. It was right in the center of the room, next to the figure. It was big, dark, solid wood. I saw it. You saw it too, didn't you? Mark's face twisted in confusion. No, I don't remember a box. There was nothing in that room. There was only it, the thing that was after us. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I processed what he said. He didn't remember the box, but I did. I had seen it clearly. It had been there, and the figure, whatever it was, had been standing beside it. But now, Mark was telling me it wasn't real. Was it? I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something, that we hadn't escaped entirely, that something had followed us, had gone with us somehow, even if we had gotten out of the building physically. Maybe we should leave, Mark said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Maybe we're not supposed to know what's in that room. Maybe we're not supposed to. Shut up, I snapped, suddenly irritable. You don't get it. We can't just walk away. Something happened in there, and I stopped myself, breathing deeply. I just can't let it go. There's something we're not seeing, something we missed. Mark's eyes darkened. You don't get it. What if we don't want to know? What if it's better to leave this alone? I shook my head, frustration rising in me. I can't. We can't. It's like we're supposed to forget, but I can't. We need to understand what happened, or it'll never leave us alone. Mark was silent for a moment, his eyes darting around the room. I could see the fear in his eyes. We had been through something that no one should ever have to face. But as much as he feared it, as much as I did too, I knew we couldn't just walk away without answers. We stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and moved toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Something told me that whatever we thought was over, it wasn't. The building around us felt colder now, and the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and I froze. Mark didn't even flinch. He had expected it, or maybe he was too tired to care. But me, I couldn't move. The door didn't open. The room didn't shift. And though we couldn't see it, we both knew it was waiting for us, whatever was behind it, whatever had been inside that room. We weren't done yet. There were still unanswered questions, and there was still something in the dark, watching, waiting. And that was the part we could never escape. We never truly left that room. No matter how far we ran or how many doors we closed behind us, the feeling lingered, like an imprint on the soul that couldn't be erased. Sometimes I still wake up with that same sense of suffocation, the tightness in my chest, the hollow feeling deep in my bones. I've come to learn that there are things you can't outrun. They follow you. They cling to you, even if you're miles away from where it all began. Mark and I both tried to move on. Life outside seemed normal at first. The hum of everyday routine, the constant buzz of work, the sounds of traffic outside the window. But that wasn't enough to drown out the silence that followed us. The darkness we'd walked away from never quite faded. I couldn't escape the images of that place, of the figure in the shadows, of the box, of the sound, that sound scraping at the edges of my memory, gnawing at the back of my mind like a persistent echo. We had gotten out, but it had stayed with us. I remember trying to talk about it just once when the weight of it felt unbearable. I was sitting across from Mark in the small cafe we used to frequent. The coffee was cold in front of me, untouched, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. I needed answers, some closure, some peace. So I spoke up. "Do you still think about it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't look him in the eye. I didn't want to know the answer. Mark didn't respond right away. He stared down at his hands, clasped tightly together, and for a moment I thought he hadn't heard me. But then he spoke, his words slow and careful. "Every day," he said quietly. "Every damn day. I can't get it out of my head." I nodded, understanding, but it wasn't comforting. It never was. We had tried to go back to that building, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the answers would be there. But when we stood outside, staring up at the familiar walls, a strange kind of dread washed over us. We couldn't do it. Not again. It wasn't safe. It never had been. The memories of that place were too powerful, too invasive. So we left. But we still couldn't forget. Mark eventually moved away, far from here. He said he needed a fresh start, needed to put the past behind him. I understood, though I wasn't ready to let go. I stayed. There was something about this place, about the building we left behind, that I couldn't fully escape. It was like a magnetic pull that kept me here, even though I knew it was dangerous. The fear of what I didn't know was always worse than facing the truth. I tried to continue with my life, burying the memories beneath the surface like rocks in the sand. But they always found a way to resurface. The dreams started soon after Mark left, disturbing, vivid dreams, where I'd be back in that room, staring at that door, waiting for something to happen. And it always did. That laugh, that horrible sound, would echo through the dark, and I'd be trapped, unable to escape. It was worse than anything that had happened before. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't pretend to forget. I made my way back to that place, back to the building where it all started. I don't know why. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, what I hoped to find. But it called to me, the pull too strong to resist. As I stood in front of the familiar entrance, a sense of cold dread washed over me. My heart hammered in my chest. But I knew this was the only way I could find peace. I stepped inside. The hallway was just as it had been before, cold, empty, oppressive. My footsteps echoed through the silence, each step sending a shiver down my spine. I reached the door, the one that had been locked all those nights ago. But this time, it was different. The door was open, just a crack, barely visible in the dim light. I hesitated. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick and heavy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. My hand hovered above the door handle, trembling slightly. But I pushed forward, opening the door slowly, cautiously. Inside, it was just as I remembered. The room, the shadows, the box. It was all there, waiting for me. But this time, something was different. The figure wasn't standing by the box. It wasn't in the room at all. The space was empty. I stepped in, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with an unfamiliar sense of calm. Something was wrong in a way I couldn't explain. As I moved closer to the center of the room, I saw the box. It was open now, the lid lying beside it. My heart raced as I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the edge of the box. And then I heard it. That laugh. Soft at first, like a murmur in the distance, but then louder, closer. It was like it was coming from inside the box itself, or maybe from deep within me, echoing through the empty space. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I couldn't pull myself away. The laugh was rising, growing, the sound wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. And then it stopped. Just like that. Silence. Perfect, eerie silence. I looked down into the box. There was nothing there. No figure. No object. Nothing. But I knew something had been there. Something that shouldn't have been. And whatever it wasn't gone. It never had been. I left. I never went back. I couldn't. I can still hear that laugh sometimes, lingering at the edges of my mind. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll swear I can see a shadow, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what happened in that room, or why it happened. Maybe it was something beyond understanding. But whatever it was, it didn't end. It won't end. And I've learned that there are places you can go, things you can experience, that can never be fully erased from your mind. They stay with you. They follow you. And no matter how far you run, you're never truly free. I've always been the type of person who finds comfort in the ordinary. The predictable, the steady rhythm of everyday life, nothing too wild, nothing too strange. I've always prided myself on being a practical, no-nonsense kind of guy. So, when I set out on a routine road trip one evening, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. It was a Friday, a clear evening in the middle of spring. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a pinkish glow that faded into the darkening sky. The kind of sunset that makes you feel like everything's in its place, that the world's just how it should be. I had a business meeting a few hours away, and the drive was supposed to be smooth, no detours, no accidents, just a few hours of uninterrupted road time. I'd been on this route countless times before, so I wasn't worried. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong. The only thing that mattered at that moment was the quiet hum of the engine and the sound of the radio playing softly in the background. I wasn't alone on this trip. My friend, Ryan, was with me. Ryan and I go way back. We've known each other since high school, and over the years, we've kept in touch, meeting up now and then for these road trips. Ryan's a practical guy too, always calm, always collected. He's the kind of person who wouldn't think twice about taking a detour if the GPS rerouted us, but he'd also be the first to roll his eyes if something seemed a little off. That's why we get along so well. We both have that laid-back, skeptical approach to life. The drive started as you would expect. We had a few casual conversations about work, life, and whatever else came to mind. The kind of chatter you don't have to think too hard about. We stopped at a gas station midway for some snacks and drinks. I grabbed a coffee. Ryan picked up a soda. Nothing out of the ordinary. The kind of pit stop that didn't seem worth mentioning at all. After a few more miles of open highway, I glanced at the GPS on my phone, making sure we were on the right track. The route was clear, and the map was showing no signs of any obstacles ahead. It felt almost too perfect, like everything was lining up as it should. We were on a well-traveled road, but it wasn't one of those highways where there was a lot of traffic, especially this time of night. The road stretched out before us, dark and quiet, the occasional streetlight flickering in the distance. We had about an hour left in the drive when the first weird thing happened. The GPS began to act up. Normally, I wouldn't think much of it. We've all had those moments where the GPS loses signal or the app glitches for a second. But this wasn't just a simple glitch. It started rerouting us. At first, I thought it was just a fluke. I pulled over to the side of the road to double check, figuring I might have accidentally touched the screen or something. "Man, are you sure this is the right way?" Ryan asked, staring at the screen with a frown. I didn't know what to tell him. The map was showing us veering off the highway, heading into a much smaller, less familiar road. I clicked on the recalculate button, thinking it would get us back on track. But instead of returning to the main highway, the map zoomed in, showing us deeper into the dark countryside. "It's just a shortcut," I told Ryan, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But deep down, something didn't sit right with me. I wasn't used to this route, and the area on the map looked more desolate than usual. "Is it?" Ryan asked, raising an eyebrow. "Feels like it's sending us into the middle of nowhere." We both stared at the screen for a moment. The road on the GPS was narrow, almost like it was going through some kind of forest or rural farmland. There were no street signs, no markers to indicate we were still on a main road. "All right," I said, trying to shake off the unease creeping in. "Maybe it's just trying to avoid traffic or something. Let's follow it for a bit and see where it goes." Ryan didn't argue, but I could tell he was just as skeptical as I was. The GPS kept rerouting us, taking us further down the darkened road, and before long, the paved road turned into gravel. It wasn't what we were expecting, but we kept going, figuring we'd find our way back to a main road soon enough. The further we went, the more isolated it felt. The trees around us were dense, and the moonlight barely pierced through the canopy above. The eerie silence in the air made the hum of the engine feel louder than it was. I glanced over at Ryan, who had fallen silent. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. Instead, he was staring at the GPS screen, his brow furrowed. "Do you hear that?" Ryan asked suddenly. I hadn't heard anything at first, but then I realized what he meant. It was a strange sound, something faint, like a low hum or a buzzing in the distance. "Probably just some farm equipment or something," I replied, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The road ahead was deserted, and the feeling of isolation was becoming overwhelming. "Maybe we should turn back," Ryan suggested. But before I could respond, the GPS screen flashed again, rerouting us once more. This time, it directed us down a road that wasn't even on the map. The path was dark, the trees loomed even closer now, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each turn taking us further away from the familiar highways and into a quiet, isolated area. The trees around us grew thicker, their branches casting long shadows that danced across the windshield. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound that broke the silence, aside from the occasional click of the turn signal when I made another attempt to adjust the route on the GPS. The map kept showing us going deeper into unfamiliar territory, but I was reluctant to stop, unsure whether we'd find a way back if we did. Ryan had fallen quiet beside me, his eyes glued to the GPS screen. His expression was hard to read, but I could tell he wasn't comfortable. We were supposed to be on a shortcut, but everything about this detour felt wrong. There was no indication of another car for miles, and the road, which had already been narrow, became even tighter as the trees crowded in around us. The pavement beneath us was cracked and worn, the kind of road you only found in places where no one really went anymore. I glanced over at Ryan, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Do you think we missed something? This doesn't look like a shortcut to me." I could feel the tension in his voice, a nervous edge that wasn't there before. Ryan wasn't someone who got rattled easily, and if he was feeling off, then that made me even more uneasy. "I don't know," I replied, trying to sound calm. "It's fine. We'll find our way out soon enough. This kind of thing happens sometimes." I looked back at the GPS screen, hoping to see a clear direction, but the map was still showing us moving through an area that didn't make sense. No towns, no intersections, just an empty, winding road that seemed to go on forever. I fiddled with the phone, trying to get it to redirect us to something familiar, but it wasn't working. The little blue dot on the screen was still showing us moving deeper into the woods. The trees ahead looked almost as though they were closing in on the road, and the occasional flicker of a light from a distant house seemed miles away. "Maybe we should turn around," Ryan suggested again, his voice carrying more weight this time. I paused, staring out the windshield. The road ahead was dark and narrow, but there was a strange pull to it, as though it was dragging us forward. I couldn't explain why, but something about it made me feel compelled to keep going. Just as I opened my mouth to respond, a sudden thud echoed through the car. It was a strange sound, like something hitting the side of the car. I instinctively swerved slightly, my hand gripping the wheel tighter. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" Ryan's voice was almost a whisper now, a quiet disbelief in his tone. I nodded, my eyes scanning the sides of the road. "Yeah, I heard it." I slowed down, trying to peer into the darkness outside. The thud had come from the right side of the car, and I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else. My thoughts raced, and I felt a rising sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. There was no way it could have been a person. It was too fast, too random, but the suddenness of it made my pulse quicken. "It's probably just a branch or something," I said, trying to reassure both of us. "The trees are close to the road, and it's probably just some winds." Ryan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward and peered through the windshield, his eyes scanning the side of the road. I kept driving, even though I was more than a little shaken. The feeling of being watched lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a strange sensation, one I couldn't explain, but it made every nerve in my body tingle. A few minutes later, the road opened up slightly, just enough to give me some relief. The trees parted, revealing a narrow clearing to the right where an old, abandoned house stood in the distance. The place looked like it had been deserted for years. The windows were boarded up, the front door hanging loosely on its hinges, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. The house gave off an aura of neglect, like it had been forgotten by time itself. I pulled over to the side of the road, instinctively reaching for the phone to check the map again. The GPS still hadn't updated, still showing us moving deeper into the woods. Ryan stared at the house for a few seconds before speaking. That place. It's weird. Looks like it hasn't been touched in years. I nodded but didn't say anything. The house felt wrong, like a strange, unfinished thought that didn't belong. The longer I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly had an overwhelming urge to leave. "Let's just keep going," I said, my voice sounding more forceful than I intended. "We'll find our way back to a main road." Ryan didn't argue, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He was just as unnerved as I was, but he was doing his best to keep it together. We both knew that if we stayed any longer, the silence would drive us mad. I shifted the car into gear and began to pull away from the clearing, but before I could fully accelerate, the car jerked slightly. I slammed my foot on the brake, and the car came to an abrupt stop. "Great," I muttered, staring at the dashboard. "Now what?" Ryan turned to look at me. "What happened?" "I don't know," I said, trying to start the car again. But the engine sputtered and died. I tried it again, turning the key, but nothing. Silence. I cursed under my breath and pulled the keys from the ignition. My mind was racing. I got out of the car and walked around to the front. The headlights cast eerie shadows on the surrounding trees, making everything feel surreal. I popped the hood and stared at the engine. Everything looked fine. The battery was still connected. There were no visible signs of damage. "Are you serious right now?" Ryan called from inside the car. I slammed the hood closed and walked back to the driver's side, my heart pounding. "I don't get it. It just stopped." Ryan's eyes were wide with worry now. "What do we do?" I took a deep breath, trying to think. The idea of being stuck out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation for what was happening, made my stomach twist. "I'll try the phone. Maybe we can call for help." But when I pulled my phone out and tried to make a call, the screen flickered. The signal bar on the top was completely empty, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get a connection. Not even a single bar. "Great," I muttered, looking up at the dark sky. "This is just perfect." There we were stuck, no way to call for help, and in a place that felt more and more like a trap the longer we stayed. Something wasn't right, and neither of us could put our finger on it, but we both knew, deep down, that the next few minutes were going to be the start of something far worse. Ryan looked around, his unease palpable. "I don't like this. I really don't like this." I didn't have the words to comfort him. In fact, I was starting to feel the same way. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in more trouble than we realized. I tried the car one more time, praying it would start, but the engine didn't even make a sound. That was when we both heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping from somewhere off in the distance. It wasn't just the sound of a branch brushing against the car or wind rustling the trees. It was something else, something purposeful, and it was coming closer. Ryan and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew whatever was out there wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't something we wanted to meet. The tapping noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a brief moment, the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. But the silence that followed felt thick and suffocating, like the world around us had paused, waiting for something to happen. Ryan and I sat there, motionless, staring out into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't bring myself to turn the key in the ignition again, even though the car still refused to start. The idea of being stuck here in the dark, with no way to contact anyone, was overwhelming. "I don't like this," Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced nervously toward the dark tree line, his eyes flicking back to me. "We need to get out of here now." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "I know, but we can't stay here. We need to find help, or at least some kind of cell signal to get in touch with someone." I had the feeling that Ryan was right. The longer we stayed, the worse it felt. This wasn't just a car breakdown or a wrong turn. It was something bigger, something that neither of us understood. I had no idea what could have caused the engine to shut off like that, or why our phones had no signal, but something in my gut told me that there was something else at play here. Something unnatural. We both got out of the car, the air cool and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The woods stretched endlessly in all directions, their shadows thick and impenetrable, making it impossible to see very far into the distance. The moonlight filtered through the canopy of trees in broken patches, casting a ghostly glow over everything. My eyes kept darting around, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless dark expanse of trees and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I checked my phone again, hoping for a miracle, but the screen was still blank. There was no signal, no bars, not even the usual "no service" message. Just a dead, lifeless screen that seemed to mock me. "Nothing," I said, my frustration rising. "I don't get it. This is ridiculous." Ryan stood a few feet away, looking off into the trees. I could tell he was trying to make sense of everything, just like I was. "Should we try walking?" he asked, his voice low. "Maybe if we walk a little ways, we can find someone or at least something." I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the car. The thought of leaving it behind wasn't appealing, especially since we had no idea how far we were from civilization, but Ryan was right. Sitting here wasn't helping us. "Yeah, let's try," I replied, even though a part of me wanted to stay put. But something about the stillness of the woods, the way everything felt wrong, made it impossible to ignore the growing sense of unease. We set off down the road, walking side by side, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the gravel beneath us. I kept my eyes ahead, but I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder from time to time, half expecting to see something or someone standing just behind us. The deeper we walked into the woods, the more oppressive the air became. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in around us, blocking out the light and making it harder to see. The once clear path we had been following had become overgrown with weeds, and the gravel was replaced by soft, wet earth that sucked at our shoes with every step. The first strange thing happened when we reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old stone well, overgrown with vines and surrounded by a circle of moss-covered rocks. It looked ancient, like it had been here for hundreds of years, untouched by time. Ryan stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the well. "What the hell is this?" I walked over to the edge of the clearing and looked down into the well. The stone walls were cracked, and the bottom was filled with dark, stagnant water. But what caught my attention wasn't the well itself, it was the faint glow that seemed to emanate from within it. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the moonlight, but as I stared, I realized that there was something glowing deep inside the well, something faintly pulsing, like a heartbeat. I stepped back, unease creeping up my spine. That's not right." Ryan took a few cautious steps closer to the well, peering down into it. "You see that too, right? What is that light?" I didn't have an answer, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I suddenly felt as though we shouldn't be here, like we were trespassing in a place where we didn't belong. "We should go," I said, my voice tense. "Let's keep moving." We turned to leave the clearing, but as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us waiting. My skin prickled, and I glanced back once more. The well was still there, the eerie light still glowing faintly in the depths, but now it seemed closer, like it had shifted, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn the well seemed more ominous, as if something inside was aware of our presence. We walked in silence for a while, the air growing heavier with every step. The woods had become suffocating, the oppressive stillness making it harder to think straight. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than before, and I couldn't tell if the road we were walking on was the same one we had driven down earlier. It felt different now, more twisted, as though the landscape itself was changing around us. Just when I thought we had gone far enough, a sound reached my ears. A soft, distant whisper that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was something more deliberate, something with purpose. A voice? A rustling movement? I stopped dead in my tracks, turning to Ryan. "Did you hear that?" Ryan's face had gone pale. "Yeah. What the hell was that?" I couldn't explain it, but the sound was growing louder now, like footsteps in the distance, or the low murmur of a conversation just out of reach. It was coming from all directions, making it impossible to tell where it was originating. "We need to get back to the car," I said urgently. My pulse was racing now, and my breath was coming in short gasps. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't make my body move. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows that were creeping closer. We turned and started heading back, but the road we had walked seemed longer now, the trees thicker and more oppressive. The once familiar path was now a twisting labyrinth, and every step I took seemed to take us farther away from the car. The air felt colder, and the sense of something watching us only intensified. And then we heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate steps, drawing closer. My heart slammed against my ribs as I whirled around, but there was nothing. The woods were still and silent, as if nothing had moved. We started walking faster, almost jogging, but the footsteps continued, and they were closer now, just behind us. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My only focus was getting back to the car. Ryan's footsteps quickened beside me, and I could hear him breathing heavily. The fear in his voice was palpable as he said, "We need to run. We need to go now." I didn't argue. I started running, my legs burning with the effort as the sound of footsteps echoed behind us, growing louder with every step. I dared not look back. We ran through the woods, the darkness swallowing us whole. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear a faint laugh, a low, mocking sound that sent a jolt of cold fear through my veins. We were running on instinct now, our feet pounding the soft earth beneath us. But it didn't seem to matter how fast we moved, the footsteps behind us were still there. They were just a few feet away, their rhythm synchronized with ours. And every time I glanced back, the shadows seemed to grow longer, as if something or someone was gaining on us. The woods, once just a place of towering trees and distant sounds, had become a prison. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the path ahead was no clearer than the darkness we had just fled. Every tree, every rock, every branch seemed to close in on us, narrowing our already limited escape route. The once comforting rustling of leaves now felt menacing, like 1,000 whispers that reached our ears, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. I was gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs heavy with exhaustion. I could hear Ryan's labored breathing beside me, and every now and then I heard him mutter under his breath, though I couldn't make out the words. His voice, usually steady and calm, was now panicked, his nerves starting to unravel as quickly as my own. The shadows moved. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I saw a figure darting between the trees, its movements quick and erratic. It was impossible to make out its shape, but there was no mistaking the sense of dread that washed over me. It wasn't just the sight of something moving in the dark. It was the presence of something that shouldn't be there, something that was toying with us, as though it were relishing our fear. Ryan must have seen it too. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight, his voice trembling. "We need to get to the car now." I couldn't argue. I turned my head, desperate to catch a glimpse of anything that could guide us out, but the world around me felt like it was spinning. The trees were now bending inward, almost as though they were alive, closing in on us from every angle. The road we had walked down no longer looked familiar. It was as though the forest had shifted. Everything that had been clear just moments before was now obscured, warped into something unrecognizable. The footsteps were louder now. I could hear them closer than ever, shuffling behind us, dragging against the earth, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could explain. It was something far more unsettling, something that had no right to exist in this world. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes. They weren't human. They were too wide, too dark, and they glowed in the dark, reflecting a sickly yellow light that seemed to draw everything toward them. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice as the eyes followed me. They were just barely visible between the trunks of the trees, but they were watching, waiting. Ryan must have seen it too. "What the hell is that?" he whispered hoarsely, as if speaking any louder would make it worse. We kept running, my mind racing for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. No logic, no reasoning, just fear. We reached the clearing, the one with the well, and that's when it all fell apart. I had no idea how we'd gotten there, but there we were, standing in the same clearing where we had first noticed the well. The glow was still there, faint but undeniable, pulsing from the depths of the stone structure. But now, the well wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a beacon, drawing us in, pulling us closer to whatever waited in the shadows. Ryan took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide, his body rigid with fear. I could feel the pull, too, the same irresistible force that had been drawing us through the woods, urging us to come closer, to step into the darkness. I tried to say something, to stop him, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The world around me was closing in, the ground beneath my feet soft and unstable. The well's glow intensified, growing brighter and more hypnotic. Suddenly, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold, and the ground trembled beneath us. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something else, something deeper. I felt the vibrations in my chest, in my bones. The well began to hum, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Ryan screamed, his voice high-pitched with terror. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with panic. "What's happening?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't even move. The pressure in the air, the oppressive darkness closing in, had paralyzed me. And then the ground beneath us cracked open. It wasn't a small fissure, like a normal crack in the earth. No, this was something far worse. The earth itself seemed to split open with a deafening sound, and from the depths of the crack emerged something, a figure, a shadow, a being that defied all reason and understanding. It was tall, so tall that its head scraped the low-hanging branches above us. Its body was long, sinewy, like something that had never known the light of day. The figure was cloaked in darkness, a form that seemed to shift and ripple like smoke or shadow. But its eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. They were the same as the ones we had seen in the trees, glowing yellow, watching us with an unblinking gaze that held us in place. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. My whole body was frozen, caught in the grip of an overwhelming fear that seemed to wash over me in waves. Ryan let out another scream, this time a desperate, guttural sound as he turned and ran. But it was too late. The figure moved faster than any living thing could, its long limbs stretching impossibly far as it closed the distance between us in seconds. It reached for Ryan. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the air, followed by a sickening, wet crunch. Ryan's scream was cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of something being dragged, pulled into the darkness. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what was happening. My body moved on its own, running, stumbling, falling to the ground as I tried to escape, but there was no escape. The woods had become a maze, the trees a labyrinth that seemed to stretch endlessly, trapping me in its grip. The thing that had taken Ryan was still behind me, its presence filling the air with an unbearable pressure. I reached the edge of the clearing, gasping for breath, my legs burning with exhaustion. But then, just as I thought I was about to escape, I heard the soft, mocking sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps that grew louder with every passing second. I turned to face whatever was coming, knowing deep down that I was the next target. I was alone now. There was no one to help me. And whatever had taken Ryan, whatever had come out of that well, was coming for me next. But the thing in the woods wasn't just an animal or some otherworldly creature. No, it was something far older, far darker. It had been waiting, watching, hidden in the shadows. And now it was coming for me. I was its prey, and I couldn't run anymore. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body instinctively pushing me forward, despite the overwhelming fear clawing at my chest. I had no plan, no direction. The woods, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt like an endless maze, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. The creature, the thing that had dragged Ryan into the dark, was still behind me, its presence pressing in, suffocating me with every step I took. Its steps were slow, deliberate, but the terror it instilled was palpable. I didn't dare look back. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep going. My mind raced. How could this be happening? How had we gotten here? The past few hours had been nothing but a nightmare, a series of impossible events that I couldn't comprehend. The well, the strange occurrences, the creature in the woods, it all felt like a twisted, nightmarish reality that had come to life. But the question still lingered: why? What did it want with us? And why had it chosen us? These were questions that would never have answers. The further I ran, the harder it became to breathe. My legs were giving out, my muscles burning with exhaustion. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I had to survive. Ryan hadn't. Ryan was gone. The memory of his scream echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of what awaited anyone who dared to stay too long in this cursed place. Suddenly, the trees opened up. The dense forest cleared, and before me, the familiar sight of the old road appeared. The asphalt stretched out in front of me like a lifeline, offering a chance of escape. I didn't hesitate. I stumbled toward it, the sound of my feet pounding against the ground now a deafening rhythm in the silence of the night. The moment I reached the road, I stopped. My heart was still racing, my mind in a frenzy. I looked around, frantic, searching for something, anything that would indicate that I had made it out. But the road was empty. There were no headlights approaching, no distant sound of cars. Just the empty road, stretching off into the darkness. I knew I couldn't stay here. I knew I couldn't keep running down the road forever. But I had to keep moving. I had to keep my distance from the thing in the woods. Then I heard it, the faint hum of an engine. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, looking down the road, hoping, praying that it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The headlights appeared in the distance, slowly growing brighter as the vehicle neared. Relief washed over me, but just for a moment. I didn't know who was behind the wheel, or if they would even stop for me. I had no idea what was waiting for me in that car. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The thought of getting away from the woods, from the thing chasing me, was enough to push me forward. The car pulled up next to me, its engine idling. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me. The driver, a man in his late 30s, looked at me with wide eyes, his face pale. He hadn't expected anyone to be out here, and from the look of him, he knew something wasn't right. "What the hell happened?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't have the energy to explain. I didn't have the strength to recount what I had just endured. I could barely speak. "Drive," I managed to croak. "Please, just drive." The man didn't question me. He hit the gas, and we tore down the road, away from the woods and whatever had been waiting for me there. My eyes flickered between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, expecting to see the shadows closing in behind us. But there was nothing. The woods were behind me now, and it felt as though the grip of whatever had been chasing me was slowly loosening. I didn't look at the man beside me. I couldn't bring myself to. My mind was still in a haze, my thoughts jumbled, as if the trauma of what had happened was too much to process all at once. The only thing that mattered was that I was out of the woods. I had survived. But for how long? As we drove further, the tension in my chest began to ease. though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. There was a stillness to the air, a heaviness that lingered, even in the safety of the car. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but beyond that, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Eventually, we reached a small town. The man didn't stop until we were at the edge of it, pulling over in front of a gas station. I was barely aware of anything as I stumbled out of the car, my legs trembling with weakness. The man rolled down his window. "You'll be okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but still filled with unease. I nodded, though I didn't know if I would be okay. I didn't know if I'd ever be okay again. I wasn't sure how I would ever explain what had happened, or if I ever could. But one thing was certain: I couldn't go back there. I couldn't go back to the woods. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice hoarse. Just get out of here." He didn't argue. He gave me one last, concerned look before driving off into the night, the sound of his tires fading into the distance. I was alone again, standing in front of a gas station in a town I didn't recognize. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I had no home to return to, no answers to seek. Ryan was gone, taken by something I couldn't explain, and I had no idea why it had happened or how I had escaped. But as I stood there, in the cold night air, I realized something that chilled me more than anything I had encountered in the woods. I hadn't just survived. I had been marked. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods wasn't finished with me. That whatever had taken Ryan, whatever had made that horrible noise in the woods, wasn't done with me yet. I could feel its eyes on me, even in the darkness of the town. I could feel it watching, waiting. And in that moment, I knew this was far from over. I stood there, the cold wind biting at my skin, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't seem to make sense of. The gas station was silent, the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights above the pumps, the only sound that accompanied the overwhelming silence. I had escaped. I had left the woods behind, the creature, the whispers, the dark presence that haunted me for what felt like forever. I had survived. But survival, what did that even mean? The town around me seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The people who passed by oblivious, moving through their lives without a care, seemed like strangers to me now. How could they go about their business, drinking coffee, pumping gas, while I had witnessed something so horrifying, something that shattered everything I had ever known about reality? Ryan! I couldn't shake the image of him, pulled into the dark, his screams still echoing in my ears. His face, contorted with terror as the thing dragged him deeper into the night. He was gone, and I was left behind, marked by something I couldn't understand. As I stood there, my breath shallow, I felt the weight of it all pressed down on me. The uncertainty, the fear, the knowledge that whatever had been in those woods was still out there. What if it followed me? What if it found me here? What if I wasn't safe, no matter how far I ran? I took a few unsteady steps forward, my feet dragging beneath me, weighed down by exhaustion, fear, and the crushing realization that I wasn't free. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it would always be with me. The darkness would follow. I could feel it, like a shadow that would never leave. A car approached from down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a pair of searching eyes. I couldn't stop myself from looking. Every fiber of my being screamed to avoid it, to run, to disappear into the night, but I stayed frozen. The car slowed as it neared, and then it stopped just beside me. I didn't look at the driver. I couldn't. The window rolled down, and I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer. My mouth was dry, my mind frozen, and all I could do was stare into the face of the man in the car. His eyes were wide, almost frantic, and his grip on the steering wheel was tight. "I saw you standing here. It's not safe to be out here this late," he said, his voice soft but laced with urgency. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to talk to him. But his presence made me feel safer. Even though something in my gut told me that I should run, that I should get away from him as quickly as possible, I stayed rooted to the spot. I started, but my voice faltered. I need to leave. I need to get out of here. The man studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, without another word, he pushed open the door and stepped out of the car. "Where are you going?" he asked. I don't know," I whispered, shaking my head. "I don't know where to go." He looked around, his gaze scanning the street as if he was considering something. Then he turned back to me. "Look, you can't stay here. It's not safe. Let me help you." I didn't know if I should trust him. Something about his tone, his urgency, it seemed almost too much, as if he knew something I didn't. But I had no choice. I was broken, scared, desperate for anything that could offer me a sliver of hope. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Okay," I said. "Please help me." He led me to the car and gestured for me to get in. I hesitated, the gnawing feeling in my gut growing stronger, but I forced myself to sit in the passenger seat. As soon as the door closed behind me, I felt the weight of the world press in again. The creature was still out there, still waiting, still watching. It hadn't let me go. And this man, this stranger, he had to know something. He got in the car, starting the engine with a loud roar, and without a word, he drove off into the night. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but all I could see in the reflection was the fading image of the gas station behind us. The familiar, the known, slipping away into the distance. As we drove through the town, I watched the buildings blur past, the world outside feeling so distant, so unreachable. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, heavy and rhythmic, as the silence between us stretched on. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't even know if I could trust this man, this stranger who had appeared at the right moment. But then, as if sensing my unease, the man spoke, his voice low and steady. "It's not over, you know," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "You're not safe." My breath caught in my throat. I looked over at him, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted slightly in his seat, the grip on the steering wheel tightening. "It's not just the woods. There's something else, something you can't outrun." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" I repeated, my voice now shaking. "I can't explain it all right now," he said, his eyes flicking to me for a brief moment. "But the thing you encountered, whatever it was, doesn't stop. It follows." I felt the cold dread crawl over me again, the same suffocating feeling that had gripped me in the woods. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice desperate. "Survive," he said simply. "That's all you can do." The rest of the ride passed in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. I had survived the woods, but that didn't mean I was safe. It wasn't over. Whatever had happened, whatever had been in those woods, it was still out there. And it would find me. The car eventually slowed, coming to a stop at the edge of a forest, the trees casting long shadows over the road. The man turned to me, his face unreadable. "This is as far as I go," he said. "You'll find your way from here." I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I had no idea where to go or how to escape. All I could do was step out of the car, the chill of the night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The man didn't wait for me to thank him. He just drove off, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there, in the silence of the forest, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees to keep me company. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would ever be free. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had come after us, whatever had taken Ryan, it wasn't finished. And as long as I was alive, I would never stop running. Because the darkness wasn't just in the woods. It was everywhere. And it would never let me go. I'm a simple man, or at least I was before everything changed. I've always been the kind of person who's comfortable with the mundane, the everyday routine that marks life's usual rhythm. I work as a mechanic in a quiet coastal town. It's a small place, the kind where everyone knows everyone else, and there's not much excitement unless you count the occasional fishing tournament or the summer tourists. But even in a town like ours, there are places that have their own history, their own weight. One of those places, strangely enough, was the old lighthouse. The lighthouse stood at the edge of town, overlooking the cliffs, always battered by the wind and the sea. It wasn't in use anymore, its light long extinguished, but it remained an imposing structure, a relic of another time. For years, I'd passed it without much thought. It was just part of the scenery, a faded picture in the background of my life. But everything changed when I got a job there. It wasn't something I had planned. The owner of the lighthouse, a man who'd lived in the area for as long as anyone could remember, had recently passed away. The place was in need of repairs, and I, with my background in mechanics, was called to take a look at it. I figured it would be a quick job, maybe a weekend of work. I couldn't have been more wrong. As I stood there in front of the old building on the first day, I felt a strange sense of foreboding. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling that hung in the air, like the taste of salt water in the wind. I shrugged it off. After all, I had no reason to feel nervous. I had dealt with worse, and besides, it was just an old lighthouse. The man who had asked me to come out was Mr. Thompson, the town's unofficial historian and caretaker of most of its old landmarks. I had known him from my childhood. He was an eccentric man, quiet and reserved, but sharp-minded. He told me the lighthouse had been in the family for generations, and there were a lot of memories tied to it. I didn't press him on the details. He seemed like someone who was comfortable with silence, the kind of person who didn't feel the need to explain himself unless you really asked. "Just be careful in there," Mr. Thompson had said when I first arrived. His voice was low, almost a murmur, but I caught the edge of something in his tone. There's a lot of history in that place, and not all of it's good. I didn't think much of it. Like I said, I'm the kind of person who doesn't go looking for ghosts or mysteries. But that day, as I walked into the lighthouse, something was different. There was a heaviness to the air, a stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the dust that filled the air caught the light in strange ways. I wasn't alone, of course. There were a few locals who helped with the heavy lifting. They were all used to the lighthouse. Some of them had even worked there in the past. But none of them stayed long. They would come in, do their part, and then leave as quickly as they could. I noticed that, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. People are strange about old places, especially ones like the lighthouse. There's always a little hesitation, a little wariness. I just figured they were like everyone else, avoiding something that wasn't quite right. It wasn't until later that I began to understand the true reason for their unease. The work started out simply enough. I fixed a few broken windows, checked the wiring, and repaired a couple of rusted metal beams that had been left to decay. The old lighthouse was nothing like the new, shining beacons that dotted the coastlines of modern cities. This one had been built a century ago, a time when the world was a different place, and people's needs were far more basic. It had a sturdy design, but it was also full of oddities. Strange, winding staircases, narrow hallways that led to nowhere, and rooms that felt far too small for their purpose. At first, I focused on the tasks at hand, sweeping away the cobwebs and bringing the place back to life. But the further I explored, the more I began to notice something unsettling. It wasn't the creaking floors or the old furniture that set me on edge. It was something deeper, something I couldn't put my finger on. There was a coldness to the place, an unnatural chill that seemed to follow me from room to room. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when a draft blows through a crack in the walls. It was something else entirely, like the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The first time I heard it was the worst. I was in the lower level of the lighthouse, checking the oil tank for the generator, when I heard a faint noise, a tapping sound. I froze, trying to locate it. It wasn't the wind, that much I knew. It was a rhythmic tapping, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I stood still for a moment, listening. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the mind. But when I walked into the next room, I felt a cold hand on the back of my neck, the air thick with an invisible presence. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the silence of the lighthouse. I chalked it up to nerves, But that wasn't the last time. It happened again and again, always when I least expected it, a whisper in the dark, a movement in the corner of my eye, the floorboards creaking underfoot, though no one else was there. Each time, the unease grew. It was like the place was alive, watching me, waiting. I couldn't explain it, but I wasn't the only one who felt it. The others who worked with me, the ones who came and went, they started to act differently too. Their faces grew pale, their eyes darting nervously. They didn't stay long. Soon enough, I was left alone to finish the job, the only one brave, or foolish, enough to stay. By the time the first week came to a close, I began to feel it too. A strange pull toward the lighthouse, a feeling that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. It was like the place was calling me, and there was no escape. That was the beginning, the moment when everything started to change. What I didn't know then was that the darkest secrets of the lighthouse were about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. I had been working at the lighthouse for about 3 days when the first truly strange thing happened. Before that, it had been nothing more than small discomforts, the unexplainable creaking of the floors, the chill in the air, and the sense that something was off about the place. But on the 4th day, something happened that made me realize this wasn't just a normal, old building. There was something more to it, something sinister. It was early in the morning when it happened. The sky was still a pale shade of gray, the sun just beginning to break through the clouds. The wind was unusually strong that day, the kind of gusts that make it difficult to stand still. It was nothing new though. The lighthouse had always been at the mercy of the elements. I had spent the morning inspecting the structure, checking the light room at the top, and performing some routine maintenance. The lighthouse had a small storeroom where they kept all the tools and supplies, and I was down there, gathering a few things when I first noticed it. There was a low hum, like a faint electrical buzz. It wasn't the generator, which was running smoothly, and it wasn't the usual whistling of the winds through the cracks in the old wood. This sound was different. It felt almost mechanical, as if something was turning on inside the walls. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe the sound was just a result of the wind hitting the old structure in a new way. But then it became clearer. A distinct, rhythmic thumping echoed through the walls, like something or someone was knocking at the inside of the building. I froze. It wasn't the winds. It wasn't the structure settling. It was something else. Something more deliberate. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for the sound to stop, to prove me wrong. But it didn't. It just kept going. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The walls were too thick, and the sound was muffled, but the rhythm was unmistakable. I stood motionless in the storeroom, feeling my heart race in my chest. My first instinct was to chalk it up to the building settling, or maybe even an animal somewhere inside the walls. But something deep down told me that wasn't it. No animal could make a noise like that. No animal could maintain that rhythm, that perfect pattern. I slowly crept toward the stairwell, listening carefully. The noise continued, reverberating through the building. It sounded like it was coming from higher up, near the top of the tower. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't normal. I took the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under my weight. The air was colder as I ascended, the temperature dropping with each level. By the time I reached the top, the noise had stopped. Complete silence. I scanned the room, the old lantern at the top of the lighthouse flickering faintly in the dim light. The place was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, my instincts told me something had changed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if someone or something had been there, and now it was just watching, waiting for me to leave. I left the tower that day with a nagging unease. I didn't tell anyone about the noise, not yet. I couldn't quite explain it. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before. But as I descended the lighthouse steps, I couldn't help but feel that it wasn't the first time something strange had happened in that building. Something was off. Something ancient. Something that didn't want to be disturbed. The next few days felt different. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but every time I walked through the door of the lighthouse, it felt like the air itself was thicker. The rooms were colder, the silence heavier. The sound from the storeroom had haunted me, but there were no other signs of anything wrong. At least, not yet. It was on the 5th day that I decided to mention the noise to Mr. Thompson. He had been more than a little distant since I started working on the lighthouse, almost as though he was avoiding the place himself. I had seen him a few times around town, but each time he would quickly turn away or mutter some excuse about being busy. It seemed odd, but I didn't want to push him. After all, he had warned me about the lighthouse, hadn't he? When I found him at the local diner, sipping coffee at the counter, I approached cautiously. "Mr. Thompson," I said, trying to sound casual, "I've been hearing some strange noises in the lighthouse. Down in the storeroom, and then again at the top, near the light." He didn't react right away. He just stared into his coffee cup, his fingers twitching slightly around the rim. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. I waited for him to respond, but he didn't. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "Don't talk about it," he said, his voice low, almost urgent. "Don't go looking for things you don't want to find. The lighthouse. It's not like any other place." He didn't elaborate. He just looked at me, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of worry and something else, something I couldn't quite read. It felt like he knew exactly what I was talking about, but he wasn't willing to say more. Just finish what you're doing and leave it be," he added, more quietly this time. "It's for your own good." I didn't press him further. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I could tell it was something he didn't want to discuss. I had heard rumors over the years about the lighthouse stories from old-timers who had worked there, and from locals who claimed the place was cursed. But until that moment, I had brushed them off. That night, after the conversation with Mr. Thompson, I decided to head back to the lighthouse early. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a strange need to be there. It was as though the building was calling me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I needed to find. When I arrived, I immediately felt a change in the air. The usual brisk wind had died down, but the silence. It was different. It was thick, almost suffocating. As I walked through the front door, I noticed that the floorboards creaked more than usual, as if they were groaning under the weight of the building itself. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself. I made my way to the storeroom first. The door was slightly ajar, and the moment I pushed it open, I noticed something. The tools that had been neatly organized on the shelves earlier that day were now scattered across the floor. Wrenches, hammers, and screws were all strewn about in a disorganized mess. I knelt down, touching one of the tools. It was colder than it should have been, considering the temperature in the room. My breath caught in my throat. As I stood up, a cold draft swept through the room, and I heard the faintest sound of something dragging across the floor behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the emptiness of the lighthouse, stretching on for miles. But in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. Something was in there with me. The first sign had been subtle, but this was different. Something had changed. The lighthouse was no longer just a place. It was a presence, one that I couldn't ignore. The days that followed the unsettling noise felt heavier, like a storm that was gathering but had yet to break. Every time I stepped into the lighthouse, I could sense something shifting in the air around me, something that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the strange sounds anymore. It was the way the building seemed to watch me. The silence, once comforting, now felt like a pressure in my chest, as though the very walls were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something in the shadows, always just out of sight. I started to feel more and more like a visitor in a place I had no business being. But despite the unease gnawing at me, I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something here, something I needed to understand. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. It was on the 6th day when the events began to intensify. It started with something small, insignificant, perhaps, if viewed on its own. I had just finished my breakfast in the small kitchen downstairs and was walking through the main hall when I saw it. A flash of movement at the top of the stairwell. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe the light from the window was casting strange shadows, or maybe I was just exhausted from the long hours spent maintaining the lighthouse. But then I saw it again. A figure, fleeting and pale, moving at the top of the stairs. I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't make out any details, just the faintest outline of a person, standing there and staring down at me. I blinked, but when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. I hesitated, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind running wild, but the unease crept back in. The chill in the air was sharper now, and I could hear the faint echo of my own breathing in the silence. I made my way up the stairs, determined to find out what had caused the shadow. The light at the top flickered as I reached the final steps, the faint glow casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air smelled different now, stale, like something had been left to rot in the corners of the tower. As I moved into the light room, I noticed the first sign of something truly wrong. The lens on the light was cracked, not just a small chip, but a deep crack running from one side to the other. I inspected it closely, my fingers tracing the edges of the crack. It was recent, within the last few hours, maybe. But how? I had checked the light only the night before, and it had been fine then. It was as if something had deliberately damaged it, like someone or something wanted to keep the light from shining. The unsettling feeling intensified, but I couldn't just leave it like this. I had to fix it, or else the lighthouse wouldn't function properly. But as I began to gather the necessary tools, I heard it again, the thumping sound, soft at first, but steadily growing louder. It was coming from somewhere deep within the tower, from below the light room. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no way it was just the building settling. The rhythm was deliberate, like footsteps, echoing through the structure. I set the tools down and followed the noise, my steps slow and cautious. The thumping was getting louder now, vibrating through the walls, reverberating in my chest. It was as though the very foundation of the lighthouse was shaking. I descended the stairs, my breath quickening with each step. The air was colder now, the temperature dropping rapidly as I moved further into the tower. The thumping seemed to grow more erratic, like something was struggling to break free from within the walls. It was louder, more frantic, and then it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The room around me was eerily still, the only sound being the faint rustling of the wind outside. But the chill in the air was undeniable, and it was growing colder by the second. I knew I had to investigate, but a part of me wanted to run, to get out of that place before whatever was making the noise found me. Despite the fear gnawing in my gut, I pressed on. I made my way through the lower levels, checking each room, but everything was quiet. The storeroom was still in disarray, with the tools scattered across the floor. I knelt down, picking up a wrench that had rolled under a shelf, and as I did, I noticed something strange. The floorboards beneath me were damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. I stood up and examined the floor more closely. There was a thin layer of water creeping along the edges of the walls, as though the lighthouse itself was weeping. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no explanation for the water, no visible source. It was as if the building had begun to bleed, and the thought made my stomach churn. As I stood there, staring at the dampness spreading across the floor, I heard the thumping again. This time, it was louder, closer, and more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the air grow even colder, as if the temperature had dropped a full 10 degrees in the span of a minute. The noise was almost deafening now, and it was coming from the far corner of the room. I turned toward it, my legs trembling beneath me, and then I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, and almost human, lurched forward from the darkness. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could explain. The figure seemed to be made of the darkness itself, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away as it slowly drifted toward me, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. My heart raced in my chest, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I tried to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of whatever this thing was. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The room went silent once again. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to get out of that lighthouse. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, but whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't alone. I bolted for the door, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I didn't care about fixing the light anymore. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that place. But as I reached the front door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty, oppressive air of the lighthouse. I couldn't stay another night. I couldn't even think about staying another minute. But I couldn't leave either. The lighthouse had a hold on me, and no matter how much I tried to walk away, something kept pulling me back. The wind howled outside, its shrill cry seeping through the cracks in the walls, as if the lighthouse itself was mourning. I stood at the door, my hands still gripping the handle, as though I could somehow will it open. But the shadow, the presence I felt, pressing down on me, stopped me from leaving. The room, once my sanctuary, had turned into something alien, something hostile. I couldn't escape it. I turned back toward the darkened hallway, my eyes searching desperately for any sign of movement. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't a comforting quiet like before. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that clings to your skin and fills your lungs with dread. I didn't know if I should run or stay. If I moved, I feared that whatever was haunting this place would catch me. If I stayed, I was already caught. My thoughts were interrupted by a low growl, a guttural, unnatural sound that echoed through the hallway, reverberating in my bones. My body froze. It was the same noise I had heard days earlier, but now it was louder, angrier. Something was close. I knew it. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. The air grew even colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath misting in front of me. Then I saw it again. That same shape, that shifting shadow, now moving slowly down the hallway toward me. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears. The figure wasn't like a person at all. Its form seemed to warp and twist, flickering like a broken light. But it was there, undeniably present. It had weight. It had purpose. And it was coming for me. I backed away, my feet stumbling against the floorboards, making a creaking sound that echoed through the empty space. But the shadow didn't slow down. It seemed to glide toward me with ease, almost as if it knew my every move. The oppressive feeling in the air became suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The terror that seized me was unlike anything I had ever felt. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Then the growl came again, louder, sharper this time, coming from directly behind me. I spun around, and there it was. The shadow had taken form. It was no longer just a dark outline, but a full, solid shape. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the doorway to the light room. Its skin was pale, sickly, and stretched tightly over its bones. Those eyes were the worst part. They were dark, hollow pits, like two empty sockets, but they stared at me with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. The terror that gripped me left no room for sound. It was as though the air had thickened, pressing against my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence all around me. It was so close now that I could smell it, a rancid, decaying scent, like something long dead. In that moment, I thought I would pass out. My vision blurred, the edges of everything around me turning black. The figure's gaze seemed to pierce through me, as if it could see my very soul. My mind raced, but all I could think of was escape, getting out of there, away from whatever that thing was. But how? The door was locked. The windows were too high to reach. I was trapped. And then the unthinkable happened. The figure moved. Its hand, impossibly long and thin, reached out toward me. I could hear the scrape of its fingers against the wooden floor, the sound sending chills down my spine. The air seemed to crackle with static, and the temperature dropped even further, until it felt like the very life force was being drained from the room. "Leave. Now." The voice that came from the figure was unlike any voice I had ever heard. It wasn't human. It was a raspy, wet whisper, like something drowned or choked. The words slithered through the room, sinking into my mind. I felt the cold fingers brush against my skin, and it was like my very soul was being pulled into the darkness. I staggered backward, my body refusing to obey. I could feel my knees buckling, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The terror was overwhelming, paralyzing. I stumbled toward the stairs, but as I turned to run, something grabbed me from behind, pulling me off balance. It was the figure. Its hands, cold as death, latched onto my shoulders, dragging me back toward it. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled, my feet slipping on the wooden floor, my hands clawing at the air. "Please," I gasped, my voice cracking. "Please, let me go." The figure didn't speak, but the weight of its presence pressed down on me like a physical force, crushing the life out of me. I was fighting, but it was pointless. I had no strength left. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands instinctively reaching for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. In that moment, I understood. This was no longer just a shadow. This was something ancient, something tied to this place, something that had lived in the walls of the lighthouse long before I had ever set foot inside. It was hunger, it was rage, and it had been waiting for me. I could hear the faint sound of the lighthouse bell ringing in the distance like a death knell. The chill in the air grew unbearable, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. The room around me blurred into nothingness as the last of my strength faded. The shadow loomed closer, and I knew that I was about to become part of it, just another lost soul trapped within the lighthouse, destined to haunt it forever. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I lay there, unconscious, the dark cold wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. My mind wandered between consciousness and oblivion. When I finally came to, it was the silence that hit me first. The growl, the heavy presence that had once filled the air, was gone. The temperature had returned to normal, the weight of dread lifted as if it had never existed. But it wasn't over. I was sprawled on the cold wooden floor, my limbs heavy and stiff. The room was still dim, shadows lingering in the corners where the flickering light of the lamp failed to reach. My head throbbed, a dull, constant ache that kept me grounded in reality, and as I pushed myself up, a deep sense of dread lingered in my gut. What had happened? Was it real? Had it all been a nightmare? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that it hadn't finished with me. The echo of the figure's cold fingers on my shoulders was vivid in my mind. The words it had whispered, "Leave now," they seemed to linger in the air like a warning. I staggered to my feet, every step shaky, as I made my way to the door. I didn't know why I was still there. I should have left, should have never returned to this place. But there was something I couldn't shake, something that felt unfinished. I needed to understand what had happened. With a trembling hand, I opened the door, the hinges creaking in the silence of the house. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and still, but it didn't feel safe. My every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The whole lighthouse felt wrong. I didn't dare go back to the light room, but I had to see if the figure, whatever it was, had left any trace. As I walked toward the stairs, I glanced toward the windows. The sky outside had turned an unnatural shade of gray, thick clouds swirling as if they were hiding something. The world beyond the lighthouse felt distant, unreachable, like the shadow had taken more than just the air inside the building. I descended the stairs, my steps echoing through the building as I neared the ground floor. I could still smell the faint odor, that rancid, decaying scent that had clung to the air when the figure had touched me. The floor creaked beneath me, and with every sound, I was reminded that something had been there, not a dream, not a hallucination. Something real, something malevolent. When I reached the bottom, the sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. The front door was wide open. The wind howled, tearing through the opening like a restless spirit. But more disturbing than the cold draft was the fact that I had locked the door before. The thought sent a chill down my spine. No one had entered. No one had left. Yet the door was ajar, swinging in the wind as though waiting for me. My heart pounded as I moved closer, inspecting the door. There was no sign of the figure. No footprints leading in or out. It was as if it had never been there at all. I reached for the door to close it, but the moment my fingers brushed the handle, I stopped. Something was wrong. There, on the wooden frame of the door, was a mark. A single line, etched deeply into the wood. It wasn't a scratch or a dent, it was deliberate. It had been carved with something sharp, something unnatural. The mark resembled something like a symbol too precise, too clean for any accident. I pulled my hand away, the realization sinking in like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't over. It wasn't gone. The mark, whatever it was, had been left by the figure, a parting gift, or perhaps a warning. I stood there for a moment, frozen, as the wind rushed around me, tugging at the door. It would have been so easy to just leave, to get in my car, drive as far away as I could, and forget this nightmare. But I couldn't. I had to know what had happened. I had to understand why the lighthouse was so cursed. So I turned back, making my way toward the room where it all began. It felt like an eternity before I reached the room again, my feet dragging with every step. The space was dark and still, but I knew I couldn't ignore the reality of what I'd experienced. My mind raced through every detail. The figure, the growl, the cold, nothing made sense, but everything felt connected. I couldn't leave without facing it. I ran my fingers along the walls, the cold stone smooth against my skin. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the fear that still clung to me. There had to be an explanation. I had to find something that could prove this wasn't just some twisted nightmare. But as my hand passed over the wall, I felt it something, an indent, like a crack in the surface. Something deeper. Curious, I pushed harder. The wall gave way, a small section sliding out with a soft creak. A hidden compartment. I didn't know what to expect, but my heart stopped when I saw what lay inside. A book, old, leather-bound, and covered in dust. It looked ancient, like it had been sealed away for decades or perhaps longer. My fingers shook as I reached for it, the pages yellowed with age. The spine creaked as I opened it, revealing faded text written in a language I couldn't understand. But as I flipped through the pages, something caught my eye. It was a drawing, a crude sketch, but detailed enough to show the lighthouse, its towering structure, and the strange figure that had haunted me. The creature from my nightmares. The figure's eyes were drawn with terrifying detail, hollow and empty, staring out from the page. Underneath the drawing was a single line, written in the same strange script. And under that, something in English. The lighthouse calls. Only those who are lost can hear it. Only those who listen will find it. I slammed the book shut, my mind reeling. The words felt like they were etched into my soul. The lighthouse wasn't just a building, it was a trap. A place that called to those who were vulnerable, those who would listen to its darkness. And I had been one of those. I didn't know if I would ever escape this place, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay. The figure, the growl, the shadow, they were all part of the same thing. The lighthouse was alive, and it was waiting for the next soul to claim. I didn't wait for another moment. I ran for the door, slamming it shut behind me, the sound echoing like the final warning. The mark, the drawing, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had survived. For now. But the lighthouse still stood, and it would wait. I never went back to the lighthouse after that night. The years that followed blurred into one another, with the memory of the lighthouse and its curse lingering in my thoughts like a faded photograph. I moved on, as people do when they are haunted by something they cannot explain. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many different places I lived, that place remained with me. Some nights, when the wind howls just the right way, I hear it in eerie, distant sound, almost like a low growl. It's the same sound I heard inside the lighthouse. A sound that once seemed so close, so real, now feels like a memory trying to claw its way back into my mind. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing and my breath shallow, I wonder if I've truly escaped or if the lighthouse is still out there, waiting for me to return. I often think about the book I found, the one with the drawing of the figure. I never told anyone about it. I couldn't bring myself to. I don't think anyone would understand. Maybe it's better that way. I sometimes wonder if the book was meant for me to find, if it had been hidden there to lead me down a path that I could never leave. The one thing I've learned over the years is that some places aren't meant to be understood. Some things can't be explained away by reason or science. The lighthouse was one of those things. Its pull was undeniable. It wasn't just the place that was cursed, it was everything connected to it. The people who lived there, the souls it had claimed over the years, and maybe even me. I've tried to live a normal life, tried to forget that time, but every now and then, I catch myself thinking back to the figure, to the moment when the world seemed to close in around me. It felt like the lighthouse was a living, breathing entity, something ancient that had been waiting for someone like me to step into its grasp. There's a part of me, a dark corner of my mind, that wonders if I truly escaped. What if, in some way, the lighthouse is still watching? What if it's waiting for me to return? It's a question I've never been able to shake, and maybe that's the real curse. The fear that you'll never be free, no matter how far you run. I've kept the mark on the door in the back of my mind. Even though the door was locked, even though I closed it behind me, I know now that some things can't be locked away. Some things don't stay where they're supposed to. They follow you, lingering in the shadows of your life. And then there's the truth about the lighthouse, that it was never just a building. It was a place that called out to the lost, a place where souls wandered, drawn to its dark pull. And now, I am one of them. I've heard it said that once you felt the call of something like that, you can never truly escape. It becomes a part of you, a shadow that follows you wherever you go. I don't know if it's the lighthouse itself that haunts me, or if it's the memories, the fear of knowing that there are places in this world that can't be explained, places that aren't meant to be understood. But I do know one thing, I'm still haunted by that place, and it'll never let me go. So now, as I sit here, on a quiet night far from the lighthouse, I can't help but wonder, what if I'm not the only one? What if there are others out there who have heard the call, who have been claimed by that place in ways they cannot escape? What if there are more of us, scattered across the world, trying to live our lives, but forever tied to the lighthouse in the dark? Perhaps there is no true escape. Perhaps the lighthouse is still calling. And in the back of my mind, I hear it, just faintly in the distance. I never thought I'd find myself standing at a train station in the dead of night, waiting for a train that shouldn't have been running at all. Yet, that's exactly where I found myself one cold, eerie evening. It had been a long day, filled with the mundane tasks that make up most of my life. The kind of day where everything feels like a routine work, errands, small talk with acquaintances. Nothing exciting. But that night, something changed. A simple decision to catch the last train home turned into something I'll never forget. The station I was waiting at was old, run down, and barely used. I remember the first time I passed by it. It was nothing more than a forgotten relic of a time before my own. The kind of station you might see in an old, dusty photograph. But that evening, I found myself walking towards it. I hadn't planned on it. My regular route home was blocked by construction, so I decided to take a different way, thinking this would be quicker. There was something about this place that made it feel off. It wasn't just the peeling paint or the broken lights. It was the silence, the kind of silence that fills the air, heavy and thick, as though the world itself is holding its breath. The platform was empty, save for a few stray papers blowing in the winds. There were no passengers waiting, no sign of life except for the dim glow of a single, flickering light at the end of the platform. It felt as though time itself had forgotten this station existed. I looked at my watch. It was 12:45 a.m. The last train was supposed to arrive at 1 o'clock. According to the schedule, this station had one final train running for the night. The problem was, This station had long since been abandoned by most commuters. The schedule had been out of date for years. As I stood there, waiting for the train, I noticed the oddity of the situation more and more. There was something about the way the platform seemed to stretch out into the darkness that made it feel like it didn't belong to this world. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping unease settling in my stomach. After all, I had no reason to be afraid. There were no signs of danger, and the quiet was merely a reflection of the hour. People were probably just at home, resting as they should be. But still, something wasn't right. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of a train approaching, its whistle sharp in the otherwise silent night. My heart gave a small skip. It was almost time. I stood up a little straighter, my thoughts shifting to my destination, a quiet suburb where I lived alone. Nothing too exciting, just peace and a warm bed. The train's arrival was marked by the sharp screech of the brakes, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. The train, a decaying old model, appeared at the platform. It wasn't the kind of train you'd expect at a modern station. This one looked like it had been pulled out of another era, entirely rust on its exterior, its windows cracked, and the dull hum of an engine that didn't quite sound like it was running smoothly. I took a step forward, unsure whether it was the time of night playing tricks on my mind, or something more sinister. The train came to a slow stop, and the doors opened with a reluctant groan, as if it, too, didn't want to be here. No conductor greeted me. No friendly voice told me to hop on. Just the empty sound of the train car's interior, waiting patiently for me. I stood frozen for a moment, debating whether to board the train. The rational side of me said to leave, but I knew I didn't have much of a choice. After all, it was the last train, and I had no intention of staying at the station longer than necessary. As I stepped onto the train, a strange sensation washed over me. It was cold, far colder than it should have been for such a mild night. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but the chill didn't go away. My breath misted in front of me as I found an empty seat, staring out the window at the dark, abandoned platform. The doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, and the train slowly began to move. The lights flickered once more, casting strange shadows on the walls. I turned my attention back to the window, and for the first time since stepping onto the train, I noticed something unsettling. The station, the platform, and the tracks, everything seemed to blur into nothingness as we moved further into the dark. It was as though the world was being erased around us. There were no other stations ahead, no passing lights, and no sign of civilization. The train seemed to be pulling us into the void. A strange thought crossed my mind. Was this train even going anywhere? Or was I simply trapped in some endless loop, carried along by something far darker than I could understand? I glanced around the train, hoping to find another passenger, but it was as empty as it had been on the platform. The cold was becoming unbearable now, creeping into my bones, and the sense of isolation was pressing down on me. I wasn't sure what to think. Everything felt wrong. And in that moment, I realized this train, this station, and everything surrounding it might not be as innocent as it seemed. The train rattled on, moving steadily into the dark unknown, and with it, so did my sense of normality. What I had thought would be a simple ride home was beginning to feel like something much more sinister. The train continued its relentless journey through the night, the sound of the wheels grinding along the tracks echoing in the hollow silence. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Where was the train going? Why hadn't I noticed the eerie stillness of the station before I boarded? Something about it all felt off. But it wasn't until a small, seemingly insignificant detail caught my attention that I realized the gravity of what was happening. I tried to push the discomfort aside, focusing instead on the rhythmic clattering of the train. It was familiar, soothing, even just the sound of a train on its tracks. But that didn't last long. As the train moved deeper into the night, I began to notice the lights flickering. At first, it was subtle. A brief, almost imperceptible dimming of the overhead lights, followed by a quick return to their usual brightness. I told myself it was just a malfunction, nothing to worry about. But it happened again, and again. The dimming was becoming more frequent now, the lights flickering for longer periods of time. It wasn't just a malfunction, I realized. It was as though something was playing with the power. Something I couldn't see. It wasn't normal, and that uncomfortable feeling settled even deeper in my stomach. I looked around the train, half expecting someone else to notice the strange behavior of the lights, but the car remained eerily empty. Not a single soul in sight. Not even the conductor. No one to explain what was happening. I could hear the soft hum of the train's engine, but it felt distant, muffled, as if the sound was coming from far away. I glanced out the window again. The darkness outside had deepened, a thick void that seemed to swallow everything it touched. The lights from the train reflected off the glass, creating strange, distorted shapes as they flickered in and out. I turned away from the window, unable to shake the growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the lights. As I sat there, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread, I began to notice something else. The air around me seemed to shift, growing heavier, thicker. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes, biting at my skin. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it did nothing to stave off the unnatural chill. I had never been on a train where the temperature changed so drastically, especially not in the middle of a mild evening. I looked at my watch again. It hadn't changed. Still 1:20 a.m. I had barely been on the train for 20 minutes, and yet everything felt like it had been going on for much longer, as if time itself had warped, stretched, and bent in ways I couldn't understand. The train was still moving at a steady pace, but the unease in my chest grew with every passing second. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, an instinctual response to something I couldn't put my finger on. Then it happened. A sound, faint but unmistakable, came from somewhere within the train. At first, I thought it was just the train settling, the usual creaks and groans of the old carriages, but it wasn't. It was a soft, deliberate tapping. A rhythmic sound, like something or someone was gently knocking on the walls of the train. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I sat completely still, trying to convince myself that it was just the noise of the train. But the tapping continued, faint but distinct, almost as if it was coming from the other side of the wall. I glanced around, looking for any sign of another passenger, but the car was still empty. The tapping grew louder, and with it, the cold air seemed to intensify. It was as though the temperature had dropped even further, and the train's movement felt slower, more deliberate. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick, as I strained to listen for the source of the tapping. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady as I moved toward the door that separated the cars. The tapping had stopped, but a sense of dread lingered in the air. I pulled the door open and stepped into the next car. It was the same as the one I had just left empty, quiet and dark. But there was something different about it. The air felt thicker here, and the cold was even more intense. I walked slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't explain why. There was no one here, but the unsettling feeling only grew stronger the further I moved down the car. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a faint, indistinguishable whisper, coming from the far end of the train. My blood ran cold. The whisper was so soft, I couldn't quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was wrong. I hesitated, torn between my instincts to run and my curiosity to find out what was happening. But before I could move, the lights above me flickered violently, and the train jolted, lurching forward as though something had violently yanked it off its path. I grabbed onto the nearest pole to steady myself as the train lurched again, sending a ripple of panic through me. The lights flickered one last time before going completely dark. For a moment, everything was completely still, silent. It was as though the world had stopped moving. I stood there in the pitch-black train, trying to listen for any sound, but there was nothing. No hum of the engine, no faint whispering, just the unnerving absence of noise. My heart raced, and my breath was shallow as I struggled to steady myself in the darkness. I reached for my phone, but when I turned on the flashlight, the beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the empty seats around me. Nothing seemed out of place, just the cold, quiet emptiness of the train. Then I heard a sound, like footsteps, growing louder, closer. But I was the only one on this train. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped just behind me, and a cold gust of air brushed against my neck. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the dark car. There was nothing. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in on me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my mind desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. But nothing made sense. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the train lurched once more. The cold was still there, but the whispering had stopped. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, but the feeling of being watched, the sense of something being terribly wrong, wouldn't leave me. I made my way back to my seat, my legs shaky, my mind racing. What was going on? Why was this happening? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew there was something more to this than I could explain. And then, just as I sat back down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the window beside me, a condensation mark, as though someone had pressed their face against the glass. A face! But there was no one there. I turned my gaze away quickly, refusing to believe what I had seen. My heart pounded in my chest, and all I could think was one thing. I had to get off this train. But I couldn't. The train was already too far gone. And wherever it was taking me, I wasn't sure I was ready to find out. The train moved relentlessly through the darkness, but now it felt like it was moving through something far more oppressive than the empty night. The cold had settled into my bones, an unshakable chill that clung to me, no matter how much I huddled into my coat. The unnatural stillness had grown thicker, as if the train was suspended in a space where time itself had stopped, leaving me to drift aimlessly through the void. Every second that passed felt longer, stretching the moments into hours. My eyes scanned the train car, searching for something, anything, to make sense of the growing fear gnawing at me. But all I saw were the empty seats, the dim light overhead flickering faintly. There was nothing, just silence, and the distant sound of the train's wheels, their rhythmic churning echoing through the empty, hollow space. I looked at my phone again, still no signal. No connection to the outside world, no way to reach anyone, not even the conductor. My stomach churned with anxiety. I had to figure out what was going on. Why wasn't anyone else on the train? Why was it so cold? Why was it so wrong? The tapping from earlier soft, rhythmic had started again. But this time, it wasn't just the walls that seemed to vibrate with the sound. It was as if the tapping was coming from everywhere. The floor, the ceiling, the walls. The entire train seemed to pulse with it. Each tap sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't some trick of my mind. The noise continued for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced for an explanation, any explanation, but nothing made sense. I had been on trains before, plenty of times. Nothing like this had ever happened. Not once. I stood up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands trembling as I tried to push the fear aside. I had to do something. I had to see what was happening. I walked through the narrow corridor between the train cars, trying to steady my breath as I moved. Each step seemed to reverberate louder than the last, my footfalls ringing in my ears. The cold was getting worse. My breath came out in visible clouds, hanging in the air before dissipating into the nothingness. As I reached the door to the next car, it suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped back, my heart thudding in my chest as I stared at the door. The sound of the door slamming had felt unnatural, like a warning. The metal seemed to groan under the pressure, as though it was being pushed from the other side. My hand hovered over the handle, unsure if I should open it or leave it alone. But something in me, something deeper, told me I had no choice. I had to know. I turned the handle, pushing the door open cautiously. As I stepped into the next car, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was musty, damp, like something had been left to rot in the dark. The stench was overwhelming, and I fought the urge to gag. But there was something more. Something deeper, like the smell of decay. It permeated the air, thick and suffocating, crawling into my lungs with each breath. I moved forward, my footsteps careful and deliberate as I ventured further into the car. The lights above flickered erratically, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls, stretching unnaturally. I could hear the faint tapping again, louder now, coming from the far end of the car. It was no longer subtle. It was insistent, almost demanding. I reached the end of the car, where the noise seemed to be originating from, and that's when I saw it. The door at the far end of the train car was slightly ajar. The tapping was coming from behind that door. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I hesitated, my hand frozen in midair as I reached for the door. But then I heard something else. A soft, drawn-out whisper, as though someone was calling my name. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. My name. I pulled my hand back quickly, but the voice continued, calling me, urging me forward, each syllable dripping with something I couldn't explain. It was a command, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. I couldn't tell. The lights above flickered violently again, then went out completely, plunging the car into total darkness. The air grew even colder, and I could feel the temperature drop, like the very atmosphere of the train was being sucked into some unseen void. I stood there in the blackness, my breathing shallow, my hands trembling. The whispering grew louder now, closer, until it was all I could hear. I grabbed my phone, the faint glow from the screen casting an eerie light around me. I was alone in this car, or so it seemed, but the atmosphere had changed. I could feel something watching me, something that didn't belong, something that didn't have any right to be here. I had to leave. Now. Turning on my heel, I rushed back toward the door I had come through, but just as I reached for the handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Soft, measured, deliberate. They weren't my own. My blood ran cold. I didn't look back. I tore through the car, my breath ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps followed. They were getting closer, faster, and I could feel the air growing heavier with each passing moment. I reached the door and threw it open, practically throwing myself into the next car. The sudden burst of light from the hallway offered little comfort, and I slammed the door behind me, my pulse still racing. I leaned against the door, my back pressed against the cold metal, trying to catch my breath. The train continued its journey, but it felt like it was spiraling out of control. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, charged, like the very space inside the train was warped, twisted. I stumbled back to my seat, still breathing hard, my eyes darting around the car. The tapping, the footsteps, the whispers, nothing had prepared me for this. I had to figure out what was happening. I had to know what was causing this. I stood up once more, shaking but determined, and walked back to the train's control booth. The car was empty, the lights flickering sporadically. I moved through the car quickly, the silence now oppressive, crushing. The tapping had stopped for a moment, but I could still hear it in my mind. And the air, it felt alive, pulsing, as though the very train itself was aware of my every move. I reached the control booth and pulled the door open. The space was dark, empty, and cold. A single faint red light blinked on the dashboard, but there was no conductor. No one. Just a seat. A dead, lifeless room. The unease in my stomach grew as I stood there, staring at the empty booth, the silence pressing in on me. And then the tapping started again. Louder, more frantic. The sound was coming from everywhere now. Everywhere except the control booth. I backed away, my eyes wide with panic. What was happening? Why was this happening? It was then that I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the train's horn. But it was different. Distorted, warped, like a call to something far darker. I turned and ran. I ran as if my life depended on it, my feet slapping against the cold, hard floors of the train as I moved down the corridor at breakneck speed. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. Each breath was shallow, desperate, as I pushed myself forward, praying for some escape, some sense of relief. But the train had other plans. I could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, moving in rhythm with mine. Soft but deliberate, the sound was just faint enough to make me question whether it was my imagination, but I knew better. Something was following me, something that shouldn't be here, and it was getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The primal fear clawing in my chest told me that if I turned around, I might not be able to stop myself from running even further into the unknown. So I kept my eyes fixed ahead, my hand brushing against the cold walls of the train for support. The train was no longer just a means of transportation, it had become a cage. Every turn, every moment felt like I was spiraling deeper into its heart. I rounded a corner and collided with the door at the end of the corridor. The door to the next car, the last one. I could feel the heat of panic rising within me as I fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I threw my shoulder against it in desperation, but it didn't open. I pulled again, and that's when I heard it, the sound of a low, drawn-out breath behind me. I froze. There was nothing. Just the train's rhythmic movement, the hiss of air, and the tapping sound, always the tapping. But now it was closer, much closer. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to look, to see what was there, but I couldn't. If I did, I knew the consequences would be worse than the fear that held me in place. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there as fast as possible. But I was paralyzed, frozen in place. Then the voice came again, soft, haunting. Leave, now. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the end of the corridor, bathed in the flickering light of the overhead bulb, was a figure. Tall, dark, and almost formless. It wasn't fully solid, but its outline was unmistakable, a shadow of a man, but it wasn't human. The edges of the figure seemed to shimmer and shift, bending unnaturally, as though the very fabric of the train couldn't contain its presence. My breath caught in my chest, and the fear I had been holding on to so tightly broke free, flooding my body in an overwhelming wave. The figure took a slow step forward. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in place by the sheer magnitude of the terror coursing through me. "Please," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't speak again. Instead, it lifted one long, thin arm, pointing directly at me. As it did, the lights above flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the entire train car into darkness. I gasped, my pulse racing as I struggled to catch my breath. Then the air grew heavy. The silence, the oppressive, suffocating silence that had been creeping around me for hours, suddenly thickened. The train began to slow, its wheels grinding to a halt with a loud, screeching sound that rattled my teeth. I stumbled backward, my feet unsteady, as the train jerked to a stop in the middle of nowhere. I looked out the windows, but there was nothing. The train was stopped in the void. No station, no lights, no signs of life anywhere. Just an endless stretch of dark, empty landscape. I turned back to face the shadowy figure, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. And then, the figure stepped forward again, its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. They were a deep, unnatural shade of red. There was no expression, no sign of emotion, just an overwhelming sense of coldness and malice that seeped into my very soul. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care what was behind me. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I heard the soft sound of the footsteps following me, growing louder with each passing moment. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence closing in on me. The tapping sound, the whisper, the figure. Everything was coming for me. I found myself in the control booth again, the door still hanging open. The room was empty as it had been before, but this time it felt different. The air was thick, charged, as though something was just on the other side of that door, something waiting to break through. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, but the feeling of dread didn't lift. If anything, it grew stronger, more intense. as though the entire train was now aware of me, aware that I was here, trapped in its midst. I collapsed into the seat in the booth, my hands gripping the armrest as I tried to steady my breath. My heart was still racing, my chest tight with fear. And just when I thought I could finally calm down, I heard it again, the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from outside the booth. It was coming from inside. I spun around, eyes wide with terror, and there, standing in the far corner of the room, was the figure. It had somehow followed me, its presence filling the entire space. The red glow from its eyes burned through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. And then, it spoke again, its voice low and guttural, filling every corner of the booth. "Leave, now, or you will stay forever." The word sent a shudder through my entire body, and I knew without a doubt that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was not going to let me go. I turned to the controls in desperation. The buttons, the levers, none of it made sense. My hands shook as I tried to figure out how to get the train moving again, how to escape this nightmare. But there was nothing. The dials were frozen, the screens blank. I looked back to the figure, but it was gone. The room was empty once more. My breath came in short gasps as I backed away from the controls, my mind spiraling. What was happening? Why was this happening? And then, the train began to move again. But it wasn't moving forward. It was moving backward. Faster and faster, the train accelerated, dragging me deeper into the void. The flickering lights above seemed to stretch and warp as the train gained speed. The sound of the wheels screeching against the track filled the air, drowning out everything else. The fear, the confusion, it all blended together into one overwhelming sensation. I was trapped in an endless loop, unable to escape. The train's relentless backward motion never stopped. I clung to the seat, the vibrations of the wheels beneath me like a constant reminder that there was no escape, no relief from the madness unfolding. The landscape outside the windows blurred into a haze of nothingness, an unending expanse of darkness that swallowed the train whole, pulling it into an unknown abyss. My heart pounded in my chest, a chaotic rhythm that matched the frenetic speed at which we were traveling. I had no idea how long the train had been moving in reverse, or if time even meant anything anymore. Hours? Days? The notion of time seemed to slip away, just like everything else that had once anchored me to reality. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to keep going, if there was anything left to fight for. But there was something inside me, a small flicker of defiance, a spark of survival that refused to let me give in. I stood up shakily, the cold metal floor beneath my feet slipping as I moved. My legs felt like jelly, every step an effort to push past the paralyzing fear. The figure, the shadow, had disappeared, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was watching. It was waiting, and the longer I remained in this unholy train, the stronger it seemed to become. I stumbled toward the control booth again, my mind racing. My body wanted to shut down, but I pushed through the exhaustion. It was either keep fighting or be lost forever. I couldn't let that happen. I reached the booth and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it once again. The familiar hum of the train filled my ears, a constant noise that now felt like the heartbeat of something malevolent. The air inside the booth was heavy, like a weight pressing down on me from all sides. The monitors still flickered with a strange, otherworldly glow, showing nothing but static. But then, something changed. The monitors flashed. It was brief, but for a moment, I saw something, a shape, a shadow moving across the screens. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned forward, eyes straining, and I saw it again. The figure. It was there, inside the booth now, reflected on the screen. My blood ran cold as I looked around the small room. It wasn't just a reflection. The shadow was real, standing in the corner. Its eyes, those cursed red eyes, burned through the darkness. Its form remained distorted, a shifting presence, never fully solid. "Leave," it whispered. The words were more a command than a request, a cold, haunting directive that reverberated through my bones. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an offer. It was the promise of something terrible if I didn't obey. I took a step back, panic rising in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but there was no place to hide. There was no escape. I had already tried everything I could think of. But something in me, something deep within my gut, told me that if I didn't act now, I would be swallowed whole by whatever this place had become. The shadow seemed to move closer, its presence suffocating. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. I could feel its malice. It wasn't just a ghost, a lost spirit. No, this thing, the train itself, was something much darker. Something ancient, with a purpose that was beyond my understanding. In that moment of complete, paralyzing terror, I saw something. A small, blinking light on the control panel. The emergency brake. It was the only thing I hadn't tried. I wasn't sure what would happen if I pulled it, but it was my only choice. I moved toward it with trembling hands, the figure in the corner still watching, its red eyes never leaving me. I reached for the lever, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The shadow in the corner hissed, a low, guttural sound that filled my ears. It was the sound of something enraged. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, my breath coming out in visible puffs. But I didn't stop. I yanked the emergency brake. The train jolted violently, as if protest against my decision. The screeching of the brakes echoed throughout the entire car, the sound deafening, like the train was being torn apart from the inside. The world seemed to shift beneath me, the lights above flashing in rapid succession before they went out entirely. In the pitch-black darkness, I felt something change. The train stopped moving. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. It was as if the entire world had come to a halt. I waited, my breath shallow and ragged, my body tense, not daring to make a sound. And then, the shadow was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, too terrified to move, waiting for something, anything to happen. The silence that followed was eerie, unnatural. The air felt thick, like I was trapped in some kind of dream, where nothing made sense and time had no meaning. But then, slowly, the train began to move again. This time, it was forward. The eerie, otherworldly stillness lifted as the wheels began to roll once more, the monotonous sound of the train's movement filling the air. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the control panel, waiting for some indication that I had truly escaped, that the nightmare was over. But the emptiness outside the window remained, just as it had before. No stations, no lights, nothing but a vast, endless stretch of dark. And yet, somehow, I felt as though I had crossed into another realm entirely. I took a deep breath and looked around, half expecting the shadow to return, to fill the room with its haunting presence. But it didn't. The lights flickered back to life, casting their sterile glow over the booth. Everything seemed normal. The train began to slow, and I forced myself to rise, my legs stiff and weak from the prolonged terror. I stepped away from the controls and moved toward the door, uncertain of what lay ahead. As I stepped out into the corridor, I noticed something strange. The train car was no longer empty. People were sitting in their seats, going about their business, as though nothing had ever happened. I could hardly believe my eyes. Had it all been some kind of nightmare? Some figment of my imagination? I approached one of the passengers, a woman sitting near the window, staring out into the night. She didn't seem to notice me at first. But then, she turned her head slowly, her gaze locking with mine. Her eyes were wide, but not with surprise. It was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, barely audible over the hum of the train. My heart skipped a beat, my throat going dry. Before I could respond, the woman turned her head back toward the window, her face blank. And in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. No one else on this train had seemed to notice anything strange. No one had seen the shadow. No one had heard the whispering voices or felt the terror I had felt. It was as if they were all part of the train, part of the nightmare. I turned and stumbled down the corridor, my mind reeling. Whatever this place was, whatever I had just experienced, it wasn't over. I had been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a brief taste of the darkness that lingered just out of sight. But now, as I stood in the midst of what seemed like a normal train ride, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still waiting. The train continued its journey, moving smoothly forward, leaving me with more questions than answers. Had I truly escaped? Or had I simply become part of the story, just another passenger on the train, destined to ride forever in the darkness? As I looked out the window into the endless night, I couldn't help but wonder, how many others were out there, still trapped on this train, waiting for the same moment of terror to find them? The train continued its endless journey through the night, the hum of the tracks beneath it relentless and steady. Every mile that passed only deepened the sense of unease, the unsettling realization that there was no destination, no end to this journey. As the landscape outside the windows remained a blur of darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a space that defied all sense of time and logic. I kept thinking back to what the woman had said, the one with the vacant eyes. "You're not supposed to be here." I had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to her own madness, or perhaps some strange encounter with whatever dark force haunted this place. But the more I thought about it, the more the words echoed in my mind, gnawing at me. What if she was right? What if this place, the train, the journey itself, was something far worse than just an abandoned relic from the past? Was I a passenger? Or had I become part of the nightmare? The sense of isolation gnawed at me. I had never felt so alone in my life, and yet the people around me seemed oblivious to the horror that had unfolded. They went about their lives as if everything was normal. The chatter of passengers, the clinking of mugs, the soft murmur of distant conversations, these mundane sounds should have been comforting, but they only served to deepen my sense of dread. How could they not see it? How could they not sense that something was horribly wrong? I moved through the train, past rows of empty seats, each one a silent testament to the forgotten souls who had once ridden here, their stories lost to time. The further I ventured, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. The flickering lights overhead, the strange hum of the train, it all felt like a warning, a prelude to something far worse. Eventually, I found my way back to the control booth, the small space where I had tried to stop the train before. I sat down in the chair, staring at the flickering monitors, the once stark silence now replaced by an oppressive hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. It was then that I realized just how much I had changed. This train, this cursed place, had changed me. I wasn't the person I had been when I first boarded. Something inside me had shifted, like a part of my soul had been consumed by whatever dark force resided within these walls. The shadows, the whispers, they had become part of me, insidious and all-encompassing. The questions I had once asked, the hope I had held on to, now seemed like distant memories, irrelevant in the face of this overwhelming reality. I had no idea how long I had been on this train. Time had lost all meaning. There was no dawn, no sunset, no way to measure the passage of days. The world outside the windows remained an endless void, a blackened expanse that stretched to infinity. Was there even a world beyond this train? Or had I been lost to it entirely, trapped in this never-ending ride? I looked up from the control panel, my eyes falling on the passenger car ahead. It was quiet now, too quiet. The usual hum of life, the quiet murmur of voices, had ceased. The seats were empty again. The train was silent, save for the occasional creak of metal as it continued to barrel down the tracks. I stepped out of the booth and into the car, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, to ask someone, anyone, if they knew what was happening, if they had any answers. But there was no one to ask. The car was abandoned, just like all the others. And then, as I passed by one of the windows, I saw it. A flicker of movement. Someone was standing just outside the train, in the dark expanse beyond the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure, trying to make out its features, but the darkness outside was too thick, too impenetrable. The figure moved closer, pressing its face against the glass, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the same figure I had seen before the shadow, the thing that had haunted me from the moment I stepped onto this cursed train. I backed away, my legs weak beneath me. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't look away. The eyes of the figure seemed to reach into me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I knew with a terrible certainty that it was coming for me. The train's hum grew louder, more insistent, as if the very metal of the train was vibrating with anticipation. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the train had taken root inside me, its dark force holding me in place. And then, the lights went out. The train was plunged into total darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no motion, no sensation. It was as if the train had stopped altogether. But I knew it hadn't. I could feel it, deep in my bones, the relentless motion, the pull of the tracks beneath me. A low, guttural noise filled the air, the sound of something scraping against metal, something large and terrifying, its presence closing in on me. I could hear it moving through the darkness, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The figure, no, the thing was here. It was so close now, so close that I could feel the cold, oppressive presence of it closing in. And in that moment, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was never meant to be on this train. I was a passenger, yes, but not in the way I had once thought. I wasn't just riding the train, I had become part of it. The thing outside the window, the shadow that had followed me from the very beginning, wasn't just a spirit or a figment of my imagination. It was a manifestation of the train itself, a dark, malevolent force that had existed long before I stepped on board. And now it had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before me. And there was no escape. I screamed into the darkness, my voice swallowed by the unyielding silence of the train. I felt the cold touch of something brushing against my skin, icy fingers that sent waves of terror through me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Its presence was everywhere, suffocating, inescapable. The train lurched forward again, its motion steady and unyielding. I was no longer sure if I was awake or if this was all just a nightmare that I would never escape. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the train and its never-ending journey. And so, as the train continued to race through the blackened night, I understood the horrible truth. I wasn't just a passenger. I was part of the train. Forever. The journey would never end, and neither would the terror. I've always enjoyed the outdoors. Hiking, camping, and getting away from the hustle of city life felt like a necessary escape. The peace and quiet of nature, the scent of pine trees, and the sounds of birds chirping are a welcome contrast to the constant noise of everyday life. So, when I decided to go on a solo camping trip, I wasn't nervous at all. In fact, I was eager to spend some time by myself, deep in the woods, where I could reflect and recharge. This was late October, and the air had a crisp bite to it that signaled fall was fully in swing. The days were still warm enough, but the evenings had a chill that encouraged the lighting of a campfire. I had carefully planned this trip, choosing a remote part of the forest that I had heard about from a friend who had been there years ago. According to him, it was one of those places that people rarely visited, making it the perfect getaway. The trails were narrow, and the location was hard to find just what I was looking for. I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, and food that would last me the weekend. I set off from my car, hiking down a narrow trail that led deep into the forest. The trees were dense here, and the undergrowth was thick with fallen leaves. The deeper I walked, the more the world around me seemed to fade into silence. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss, decaying leaves, and the faintest hint of smoke from distant campfires. I could feel the weight of solitude pressing in on me, and yet I was content. This was exactly what I needed. As the sun began to set, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a creek, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. I cleared the area of rocks and debris, setting up my camp in a familiar routine. As night fell, I built a small fire, its crackling flames casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat by the fire, cooking my meal and staring into the dancing embers. For a moment, I felt at peace, just me, the fire, and the sounds of the forest around me. There was nothing strange about this place, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as I sat there, something odd happened. A movement from the edge of the clearing caught my eye. It was quick, too quick for me to make out clearly, but someone had moved just outside the reach of the firelight. I froze, staring into the darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but the sensation of being watched was unmistakable. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought. A deer or a raccoon, curious about the fire. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about the way the movement had occurred too deliberate, too human. Still, I didn't want to let myself get worked up over nothing. I had spent plenty of time in the woods before, and I knew how easily the mind could play tricks. I turned back to my fire, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. The night passed uneventfully, but as I lay in my tent later, trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The forest seemed to close in around me, and every rustle of leaves outside my tent felt too loud, too purposeful. I told myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't help it. Something about this place didn't feel right. The next morning, I decided to take a hike around the area. I needed to shake off the unease I felt from the night before. The sun had risen, casting long beams of light through the canopy above, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I walked for a few hours, taking in the beauty of the wilderness. The woods were vast, with towering trees that stretched high above me. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and every step seemed to take me further into a world untouched by civilization. But as I walked, I couldn't ignore the strange sensation that had settled over me. I had been hiking for hours, yet I hadn't come across a single sign of human life. No footprints, no campfires, no other hikers. Just silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It felt as though I was the only person in the world. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing just behind me. But there was nothing. I tried to convince myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. It was easy for the mind to start playing tricks when there was no one else around. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. And as the sun began to set again, I found myself hurriedly heading back to camp, eager to return to the safety of my tent and the warmth of the fire. That night, as I sat by the fire again, the odd feeling returned. I thought I saw something moving just beyond the trees, but when I tried to focus on it, it vanished. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. I couldn't help but feel that I was no longer welcome in this place, that someone was watching me. And I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I had to leave. The thought lingered in my mind as I sat there, the fire flickering and casting long shadows across the clearing. But the more I tried to shake it off, the more I couldn't ignore it. Something wasn't right. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or something else entirely, but my gut was telling me that I was in danger. The night dragged on, and sleep came in fits and starts. The moments when I managed to drift off were filled with strange, unsettling dreams. I dreamt of shadowy figures standing just outside my tent, their forms barely visible in the darkness. I dreamt of voices low, murmuring voices that seemed to speak just beyond my reach. When I woke the next morning, the unease that had settled in me the night before had only grown. Something had changed. The forest felt different. It was as if the trees themselves were watching me, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I packed up my camp quickly, eager to leave, but even as I hiked back to my car, I felt the strange sensation that something was following me. And so, I left. I didn't look back. I had barely reached the halfway point of my hike back to the trailhead when it happened. The morning was bright, the sun filtering through the branches above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. I tried to focus on the peaceful sounds of nature, hoping the crisp air and the occasional rustle of leaves would help clear the lingering tension that had settled in me since the previous evening. But then, something changed. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A slight shift in the wind, a change in the pattern of the trees. The world around me seemed to hold its breath for a moment. I paused, standing still in the middle of the trail, listening. The usual background sounds, the chirping of birds, the wind rustling the leaves, had stopped. There was no wind, no birds, not a single animal made a sound. It was as if the entire forest had gone completely silent, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something. For a second, I thought I had imagined it. The forest had always been a place of stillness, a quiet sanctuary, but this silence felt different, unnatural, even. I shook off the feeling, telling myself that it was just a temporary stillness, nature's own way of creating a moment of calm. I took a deep breath and continued walking, the sound of my boots crunching against the forest floor the only noise to break the silence. But as I walked, the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more oppressive. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing just behind me. But, as before, there was nothing. I picked up my pace, eager to leave this strange feeling behind. The trail seemed longer than it had on the way in, and the trees appeared thicker, more tightly packed together, as if they were closing in around me. It wasn't the physical space that bothered me, it was the overwhelming sense of being watched. That's when I heard a snap of a twig, far off to my left, just beyond the trees. It was loud enough to break the silence, and I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I turned toward the noise, expecting to see some kind of animal, a deer, perhaps, or a fox, but there was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the winds, but there was no sign of movement. For a moment, I stood still, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. I had been out here alone for hours, and I knew that animals in these woods were often skittish, avoiding humans. This was different, though. The sound had been deliberate, like someone or something had been trying to be quiet, to hide. It wasn't the usual sound of wildlife. It was far too precise. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, and took a cautious step forward. I couldn't see anything, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up now, my senses on high alert. Another snap, this time closer, followed by a rustling of leaves, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart racing. It was too calculated, too coordinated. It was then that I realized something had changed. The forest, which had once felt like a comforting, peaceful place, now felt menacing. Each step I took, each sound I heard, seemed to echo in my mind, amplifying my anxiety. I quickly tried to dismiss the thought, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that the forest had a way of playing tricks on the mind, but deep down, I knew something was off. Still, I pressed on, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being followed. But every step I took, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder again, only to find nothing behind me but trees. By the time I reached a bend in the trail, my nerves were completely frayed. I stopped again, standing at the edge of the trees. The path continued straight ahead, but something in the distance caught my eye. A figure. It was a shadow, barely visible through the trees, standing motionless at the edge of the forest. For a moment, I froze, my heart in my throat. It was a person, or at least, I thought it was. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I quickly scanned the area, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was no sign of anyone. The only movement was the sway of the branches above, the winds picking up again. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been a person? A trick of the light? Or had my mind finally given in to the isolation and the tension of the past few days? I couldn't be sure, but I was certain that something was wrong. The air had grown colder, and the forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer together as though the path ahead had shrunk. I looked down at the ground, trying to steady myself, when I noticed something odd: footprints in the dirt. The trail was soft here, and the ground had been undisturbed, but now there were clear, fresh tracks. They were large, with deep impressions in the earth, as if something had walked this way recently. The footprints weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too deliberate, and they led off the trail and into the dense underbrush, disappearing into the trees. I bent down, running my fingers along the edge of the tracks. They were still soft, still fresh. My heart began to pound again. I had been walking down this trail for hours, and I hadn't seen anyone. Who else could be out here? I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of mistake, that the prints could have been made by someone else earlier in the morning, maybe even another hiker. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was not alone in these woods, and whatever had left those tracks was still nearby. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my hands, and glanced around again. The forest felt different now, thick, suffocating. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in on me, blocking out the sky above. My breaths came faster, more shallow, as the fear settled in deep. I turned back to the trail, determined to make my way out of the forest as quickly as possible. But then, just as I started to walk, I heard it again. The snap of a twig, loud and clear. This time, it was right behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. Slowly, I turned around. The forest was silent once more, the wind having died down. But there, just beyond the trees, standing motionless, was the same shadowy figure. This time, I didn't wait to see if it would disappear again. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the forest floor as I made my way down the trail. The trees blurred around me, and I felt the branches scratch at my skin as I pushed my way through. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct told me to keep running, to get as far away from that figure as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, it felt like something was always just behind me, following my every step. And that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, matching mine, following me through the woods. I didn't look back. I just kept running. My heart raced as I sprinted down the trail, the sound of footsteps behind me growing louder with every stride. My breath was coming in short, ragged bursts, but I didn't dare stop. The feeling of being pursued, of being hunted, pressed in on me, suffocating the air around me. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of the leaves made me freeze, my senses straining for any sign of movement. The woods had gone eerily quiet again, but I could hear someone moving just out of sight, keeping pace with me, never letting up. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, but there was no escaping the feeling that the woods themselves were closing in. I veered off the path at a sharp bend, hoping to lose whatever was behind me. The underbrush scraped against my legs as I pushed through, the sharp smell of pine and wet earth filling my nostrils. The sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the very air had thickened and was pressing in on me. I glanced back over my shoulder, nothing. But the sensation of being watched remained, stronger than before. I stopped, trembling, trying to control my breathing. I had to think. I couldn't keep running blindly through the woods. My instincts screamed at me to get out, to leave, but I needed to understand what was happening. Was I imagining all of this? Or was there something out there? I turned back to the path, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The silence around me was deafening now, the only sound the distant chirping of birds, which felt out of place in the thick tension of the air. I forced myself to look around, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the usual forest scenery, ancient oaks, towering pines, their dark, twisted branches stretching toward the sky like gnarled hands. But even in the familiar sight of the woods, there was an unease, a sense that something was wrong, that something was watching. I couldn't shake the feeling. I knew I needed answers, but where could I find them? This place had always been just a quiet forest, a place for peace and solitude, but now it was something else. I had to figure out what was going on. The decision came suddenly. I needed to retrace my steps, find the place where I'd first felt the unease, the place where I had seen that shadowy figure. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was a rational explanation. With my pulse still pounding, I made my way back to where I had heard the snapping twig, the place where I'd first caught sight of the strange figure standing motionless in the distance. My feet felt heavy, as if the earth itself was resisting me, holding me back. The air felt thick and heavy, and every step I took seemed to bring a sense of dread, an almost magnetic pull, drawing me further into the woods. The path seemed darker now, the trees more foreboding, their branches bending low, casting long shadows that reached across the trail. I reached the spot where I had seen the figure before, but there was no sign of it. Just the usual forest floor leaves, pine needles, damp soil. No footprints, no strange marks. Just nothing. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. Had I been imagining things? I wasn't sure anymore. The weight of the forest pressed in on me, making it hard to think clearly. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I needed to understand what was going on here. I crouched down, inspecting the ground carefully. There were no footprints, no signs of anything unusual. The earth was soft, but there was nothing to suggest that anyone had passed this way recently. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my hands, my thoughts racing. What was it I had seen? And then I heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling coming from behind me. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. Only the trees, silent and still. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment I felt dizzy. I wasn't imagining things. Something was out there. Something was following me. I started to move again, but this time I wasn't just walking, I was looking for something. Anything. I needed to understand what was happening. I ventured deeper into the woods, following the trail as it wound its way through the thickening trees. The silence that had been so overwhelming before had returned, but it felt different now. More oppressive. The air was colder, and I could almost feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me. It wasn't just the trees, it was the space between them, the sense that something was just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay focused, forcing my breathing to steady. I reached a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a patch of ground that had been trampled, the earth scuffed and torn. It was as if something had been dragged across it, but the markings were too faint to make out clearly. I knelt down to inspect the ground, my fingers tracing the lines of the disturbed earth. My hand froze when I felt something hard, like a rock or a bone, buried just beneath the soil. I pulled at it, digging into the ground, and unearthed a small, weathered object. It was a piece of fabric, torn and frayed at the edges, a dark stain on its surface. I stared at it for a moment, my mind racing. What was this? Why was it here, in the middle of the forest? I heard a sound again, sharp and distinct, this time much closer. A footstep. But when I looked up, there was no one there. I glanced around, my body tense, my senses on high alert. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves this time, it was footsteps, deliberate and measured. I could hear them, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs breaking underfoot, coming from somewhere just out of sight. I was no longer alone. The tension in the air was unbearable now, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a heavy cloak. The trees seemed to shift and sway in a way that wasn't natural, their branches moving against the wind, bending at strange angles. I felt the ground beneath me shift, and when I looked down, I saw the faint outline of more footprints, large, heavy prints, deeper than any animal tracks I had seen before. They weren't from a person either. They were something else entirely, something that didn't belong in these woods. I stood up quickly, my mind spinning. The footsteps I had heard were getting closer now, coming from all directions. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but it felt like I was surrounded. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the temperature had dropped. I could see my breath now, the fog of it mixing with the thickening shadows of the forest. It was as though the woods themselves were alive, closing in around me, suffocating me. Then, without warning, a figure stepped into the clearing from behind one of the trees. I froze. It was tall, too tall, and its features were indistinct, shadowy, like it was part of the forest itself. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, cold, looming, malevolent. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. The air around me grew colder still, and I could hear the faintest whisper of something moving, something behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the darkness. Nothing. But the forest felt different now. alive, watching, waiting. I knew then that I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there in the woods wasn't going to let me leave. The air was thick, pressing in on me from all sides, as though the very forest itself was holding its breath. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I felt trapped, each breath heavier than the last, the shadows around me deepening, growing darker and more oppressive with each passing moment. The figure I had seen standing in the clearing had not moved. It was still there, unmoving, watching, like a dark sentinel. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, every instinct screaming at me to run, to flee, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by fear. I could feel it now, a coldness that seemed to radiate from the ground, creeping up my spine, settling into my bones. The forest had never felt so alien, so hostile. The silence was suffocating, as though the world around me had paused, holding its breath. I glanced at the trees, their gnarled branches twisting like hands, reaching out to grab me. I wanted to scream, to shout, to break the spell that seemed to have fallen over me, but no sound came. The figure shifted, just the slightest movement, a shift of weight, and it was enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. It was happening. I wasn't alone. I felt my legs finally move, stumbling backward, but my body was numb, my senses overloaded. Every step felt like I was wading through thick mud, slow and heavy. My breath was coming in gasps now, and my chest felt tight, constricted. I turned to look behind me, searching the darkened woods for any sign of escape, but all I saw were the endless trees, closing in like a maze. And then I heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps, but these were different. These weren't the faint, distant rustling I had heard before. They were closer, more deliberate, almost purposeful. They weren't just coming from one direction either. They were coming from everywhere, from the trees, from the underbrush, from the very ground beneath me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The air was still, silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was surrounded. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. I tried to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, caught in the thrall of something far beyond my understanding. The woods had swallowed me whole, and now it was closing in on me. It was then that I heard the sound, the unmistakable crack of a twig breaking underfoot. It was right behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and that's when I saw it. The figure that had been standing motionless in the clearing had moved closer. It was towering, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Its features were still indistinct, but I could feel its presence, like a shadow that stretched out to engulf me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. Fear had frozen me in place. The figure stepped forward again, and I could feel the air grow colder still. The shadows seemed to shift with it, as though they were alive, moving with it, reaching toward me. I wanted to run, to break free, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped, ensnared by something that didn't belong in this world. Then, as if in response to my growing panic, the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears, no. It was a voice I could feel, deep in my chest, reverberating through my bones, shaking me to my core. It was a sound that bypassed the rational part of my mind, going straight to something primal, something ancient. It was a growl, low and rumbling, like the sound of something massive, something old, something that had been here far longer than humanity could understand. You shouldn't have come here. The voice reverberated in my chest, filling the space around me, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a threat. My legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my mind spiraling. What was this? What had I stumbled upon? I looked around frantically, desperate for any sign of help, but there was nothing. The forest, the trees, the very air around me seemed to pulse with a dark energy, something that didn't belong. The figure took another step forward, its presence now overwhelming. I could see its shape more clearly, now tall, too tall, its outline shifting, as though it were made of the shadows themselves. The cold emanating from it was unbearable, freezing me to the bone. It moved again, and I flinched, instinctively trying to scramble backward, but the ground seemed to shift under me. My hands found the dirt, cold and damp, as if the earth itself was resisting me, holding me in place. The figure reached out a hand, a long claw-like hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward me, its fingers impossibly long, each one ending in a sharp, jagged tip. The air around me crackled with a sense of rawness, a palpable energy that made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, to run, to close my eyes and make it all disappear, but I couldn't. The darkness was too strong. It was suffocating. The figure's eyes, if you could even call them eyes, glowed faintly in the shadows, two orbs of dim, unnatural light, like the reflection of something that shouldn't exist. They locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew that this thing wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me to make a mistake. It was waiting for me to fall. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure stopped. Its hand froze mid-air, its claws just inches from my face. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its dark, shifting form a hint of recognition. Was it studying me, or was it deciding whether or not to let me go? "You should leave," the voice reverberated again, and this time it was clearer. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command, and I felt it deep within my soul. It was a primal instinct, an undeniable urge to run, to flee, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. My mind was clouded with terror, paralyzed by the unknown force that surrounded me. The world seemed to tilt, and the figure seemed to grow even taller, more imposing, as though it was towering over me like some ancient god. Then, without another word, the figure began to retreat. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped back into the shadows, fading into the dark recesses of the forest. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like watching something from a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. As it disappeared, the cold lifted slightly, but the weight of the fear, the dread, the realization of what I had encountered stayed with me. It lingered in the air, in my chest, suffocating me. I was left there, in the silence of the forest, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the empty clearing, my mind racing. But eventually, I stood, shakily, my legs still weak from fear. I didn't dare stay any longer. I had to leave. Whatever that thing was, whatever I had just encountered, it wasn't something I could understand. But it was real, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I turned and ran, the woods now feeling even more hostile, even more dangerous than before. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I couldn't stay. And I knew I would never be the same again. The forest seemed to close in behind me as I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Each step felt like a battle against an invisible force, as if the very woods themselves were trying to drag me back into their suffocating depths. The encounter had shaken me to the core, but even now, as I ran, the images of that figure, tall, shadowed, and cold, haunted every step. The sound of my own footsteps was deafening in the silence, and the air felt oppressive, thick with the weight of something that didn't belong. I didn't know how long I had been running, or how far I had gotten, but the anxiety gnawing at me told me I hadn't escaped yet. I didn't know what I had encountered, but I knew that whatever it was wasn't done with me. That shadow, that thing that was waiting, I could feel it. It was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of my mind, in the quiet of the forest, in the movement of the wind through the branches. The only thing that seemed to push me forward was the fear that if I stopped, if I hesitated, I would be trapped again. The feeling of something behind me, something watching me, clawed at my nerves, making it impossible to relax even for a moment. Finally, I broke through the trees, the dark expanse of the woods opening up into the clearings where the camp had been. I had made it back to the campsite, but there was no comfort there. No sense of safety. No relief. Everything was still. The tents stood as I had left them, the fire pit cold and empty. The only sound was the rustle of the leaves in the breeze, the occasional bird call breaking the heavy silence. I stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, trying to gather myself. The woods still felt alive, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The dread in my chest wouldn't loosen, no matter how hard I tried. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but there was something in me that hesitated. I wanted to understand what had just happened, what I had seen, but I couldn't bring myself to look back into the darkness. Every instinct told me to get out to leave before whatever I had encountered returned. I turned around and made my way back to the camp, finding my things scattered where I had left them. My pack, my gear, all of it was exactly where I had dropped it when I had first arrived. Nothing had been disturbed. But then why did it feel like something had changed? Like the air itself had thickened, become heavier with the knowledge that something else, something otherworldly was present? I couldn't stay there. Not now. The figure had made it clear it didn't want me here. And yet, it hadn't come for me again. I didn't know why. Perhaps I had been too much of a threat. Perhaps it had been waiting for something else. Or perhaps it had just decided to leave me, to let me go. But even as I gathered my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened wasn't truly over. With my pack slung over my shoulder, I started back toward the trailhead, toward the small town I had come from. The forest was still behind me, silent and still, but its presence hung in the air, palpable and thick. I wasn't sure what I would do when I got back to town, what I would tell people about what had happened. Could I explain it? Could anyone believe me? The encounter, the darkness, the sense of something ancient and terrifying, it didn't make sense. It was a nightmare, a terror that couldn't be fully explained, even in words. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe no one would understand. And maybe, in the end, it didn't matter. Because no matter how far I ran, no matter how far I traveled, I knew one thing for certain. That figure was still out there. Waiting, watching. And I was part of something now, something beyond my understanding. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of foreboding, of dread. The woods had chosen me, or rather, it had allowed me to escape for now. I reached the trailhead as the light of dusk began to fade, the sky turning from blue to purple to black. The night had fallen completely, and the air was sharp with the bite of cold. But even as I stepped into the safety of the town, I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like I had made it. I was still carrying that darkness with me, like a shadow that clung to my skin, to my thoughts, to every corner of my mind. As I entered the small town, the lights from the nearby buildings flickered, casting long, eerie shadows along the empty streets. It was so quiet, unnervingly quiet, as if the entire town had gone to sleep, unaware of the nightmare I had just endured. I could feel myself shivering, despite the cold not being that severe. My mind was still racing. What had I really seen? Was it just a hallucination, some trick of the light? Could there be a logical explanation for the terrifying experience I had? Or was it something beyond our understanding, something ancient that had been waiting for someone, waiting for me? I didn't know the answer. But one thing was certain. My life had changed. The sense of wrongness, the presence of the thing that had watched me in the woods, still lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had let me go for now, but it was not finished. Whatever I had encountered was out there, somewhere in the world, and I couldn't forget the feeling of its eyes on me. Maybe I would never understand what it was, but I knew I would never be the same. The woods, the figure, the air, everything had changed in an instant. And now, as I walked away, I carried it with me, whether I wanted to or not. I walked past the buildings of the town, past the darkened streets, and made my way toward the small inn where I had booked my stay. I would try to sleep, try to forget, but the nightmares, the visions, would stay with me. I could feel them pressing at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had faced and what I had barely escaped. As I settled into my room, the soft hum of the inn's air conditioning, the only sound breaking the silence, I tried to close my eyes. I tried to rest, but as soon as I did, I could see it. The figure, its eyes, that cold, oppressive presence. I couldn't escape it, no matter how much I tried. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't over. It would never be over. It was still watching, still waiting. I had only just begun to scratch the surface of whatever nightmare I had stumbled into, but I didn't know if I was ready to face it. The town seemed to be wrapped in a shroud of peaceful ignorance, its streets deserted and its lights casting long, soft shadows against the buildings. The clamor of the world outside felt like a distant memory, far removed from the terror that had just consumed me in the woods. As I sat in my room, every corner of the small inn felt too silent, too still. The bed was uncomfortable, the pillow lumpy, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that kept me awake. It was the memories of what had happened. The figure, the presence, the chilling eyes that burned into my soul as if they had seen into something deep inside me that I hadn't even known existed. There was no way to explain it, no way to rationalize the unexplainable. I tried to rest, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of the thing in the woods returned sharp, clear, more vivid than ever. It felt like it was inside my head, a part of me, its very essence intertwined with mine. I had escaped the forest, but in truth, I had never truly escaped. The woods weren't just a place, they were a part of something larger, something that now owned a piece of me. I couldn't run from it, not really. In the days that followed, the strangeness continued to follow me. It wasn't the same as it had been in the woods, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't until the third night after my encounter that I realized something. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It hadn't faded like a bad dream. It was still with me. I could feel it pressing against the back of my mind, just beneath the surface, waiting for me to slip. I'd left the woods behind, but I hadn't left the fear. It clung to me, invisible but suffocating, as though every corner of the world now hid something I couldn't see. As though the night itself held a secret that I was too blind to understand, but too terrified to ignore. I tried to tell myself that I was safe, that it was over, that whatever had been in the woods was behind me now. But every time I stepped outside, every time I found myself in an unfamiliar place, that cold, creeping feeling would return. I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow of that figure, watching me from the edge of the light. But no one was ever there. The figure was gone, I told myself. And yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't. The worst part, though, was how everything seemed normal. It wasn't like the world had changed around me. The sun rose and set, the air remained warm or cold as it had always been, and the birds still chirped in the mornings. Life went on as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't witnessed something that defied explanation. But I had. I had seen it, and no matter how many times I told myself it was over, I knew it was far from it. The encounter hadn't just been an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger, something beyond the human world. And now, I was tied to it in a way I couldn't undo. I remember one night, walking through the streets of the town, feeling the weight of all of it pressing down on me. I was restless, anxious, my eyes scanning the shadows. The streetlights flickered like they were unsure whether to stay on or off. Every breeze felt like a whisper in the dark, and every rustle in the trees sounded like a distant footstep following me. That was when I understood. The forest hadn't just changed me in the moment. It had changed something about the very nature of the world I now inhabited. It was a world where things were no longer as they seemed, where the veil between the known and the unknown had been torn wide open. And I had been on the other side of that veil, face to face with something that wasn't supposed to be seen. Something that had waited for me, hunted me, and then allowed me to escape for now. But it hadn't gone away. It was still here. I don't know if the figure in the woods was a ghost, a spirit, or something more ancient, but what I did know was that I was marked. It had found me, and somehow it had known something about me. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. Something inside me had changed, and I couldn't go back to the way things were before. It was at that moment, standing there beneath the dim streetlight, that I made a decision. I couldn't outrun this. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The fear I felt wasn't just about the thing in the woods. It was about what came after, what would follow me as I tried to move on. But perhaps the worst part of all was the realization that it might never be over. No matter how far I ran, No matter how many towns I visited, the memory of the figure in the woods would always be with me. It had become a part of me, something deeper and more profound than any physical terror. It was psychological, embedded in my soul, something I could never escape from completely. Maybe that's what it wanted. Maybe it had never intended to kill me or trap me. Maybe its purpose was to change me, to drag me into its world, and force me to live with the knowledge of what exists just outside of our perception. To remind me that there are things out there, things we are never meant to understand. In the weeks after, I tried to return to normal. I tried to move on with my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling of that cold presence, still hovering, still waiting. My dreams were filled with dark woods, and in the corners of my vision, I would sometimes see fleeting glimpses of figures tall, shadowed, and watching. They were everywhere, just beyond the edge of my awareness. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was over, I knew that it wasn't. The encounter hadn't just been a story. It had been a warning, a glimpse into something bigger than I could comprehend. The woods, the figure, the ancient force that I had barely escaped, they weren't gone. They were always there, waiting for the next person, the next soul, to wander too far. And someday, someone else would come. Someone else would make the mistake I made, and they would feel that same fear, the fear of knowing that once you've seen it, once you've encountered it, there's no going back. It's always watching, always waiting, and it will never let you go.